Chapter 151 What a great honor. It's the Navy. Is the North Sea Fleet here too? Doflamingo is such a great honor, even the North Sea Fleet sent people to congratulate him. What are you talking about? Do you think that without the acquiescence of the North Sea Fleet, the Don Quixote family can easily swallow up the entire North Sea underground forces? Could it be? Hee. Although there is no obvious evidence, it is said that Doflamingo has a special relationship with the former North Sea Admiral. The former North Sea Admiral, isn't that the King of the North Sea? Thinking of the legendary man, the invited guests couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva with a gurgle, their eyes filled with fear and submission. Many of the noble ladies and princesses who came with their husbands and fathers secretly licked their lips, not knowing what they remembered, and their eyes showed a hint of spring. In less than half a minute, under the breathless gaze of the people, the huge warship with exaggerated shape and almost made of steel has slowly entered the port. As the wooden boards fell, a team of naval elites in neat uniforms walked down from the warship steadily. The austere and boundless momentum gave people a strong sense of oppression. The leader looked quite young, only about 20 years old, but the temperament he exuded was cold and calm. The mustache on his upper lip added a bit of maturity to him, and he had a saber on his waist. The current North Sea Admiral, the Colonel of the Navy Headquarters, Flying Squirrel. Admiral Flying Squirrel, long time no see. Vinsmoke Judge showed a hypocritical smile on his face and walked forward and extended his hand. The Flying Squirrel held his hand and smiled. Mr. Jaji, long time no see. The two of them half closed their eyes and smiled, looked at each other, and after the reporter snapped a few photos, they let go of each other's hands at the same time. It can be imagined that one of the headlines of Beihai newspapers tomorrow will definitely be, Beihai. The title is, The Friendship Between the Fleet and the Kingdom of Germa Lasts Forever. The Flying Squirrel immediately looked at Senior with an approving smile on his face. You're Senior. Well, Doflamingo is indeed very discerning. Senior was stunned. He didn't expect that the Flying Squirrel actually recognized him. He pursed his lips a little stiffly and bowed slightly. Hello, Admiral Flying Squirrel. My young master is already waiting for your arrival in the reception room. The Flying Squirrel smiled and said. Then please lead the way. So under the leadership of Senior, Flying Squirrel and Vinsmoke Judge walked towards the reception room. The two walked side by side, and their respective troops kept a certain distance behind them, clearly separated. The guests looked at this scene with doubtful eyes, suppressed their inner uneasiness, and followed. The expensive crystal chandelier exuded a luxurious light, and the luxurious banquet hall was filled with gentle and melodious saxophone music. It is hard to imagine that in this banquet hall, almost all the heads and representatives of the major kingdoms and forces in the North Sea gathered. Countless businesses were finalized in the casual conversations of these people, and the occasional jokes might determine the economic lifeline of a country, and a casual bet was the fate of countless families. Hello, Mr. Fells. Oh, this is your wife. Well, it's nice to meet you, Lady Danny. Well, I have important matters here, so let's talk later. The Flying Squirrel finally struggled out of the blockade of the guests. His face was a little dark. He picked up a glass of red wine from the waiter's plate, raised his head and drank it in one gulp, and shook his head speechlessly. No, if you have something to say, just say it. Don't you just want me to help you say hello to the Don Quixote family and take care of your business? Why did you pull your wife out? The neckline of that evening dress is almost down to the navel. These people are really enough. The Flying Squirrel rubbed his temple with a headache and muttered to himself. At this time, a voice with a sarcastic smile suddenly sounded from behind. Power, status, wealth. Sometimes these things are really troublesome, right, Admiral Flying Squirrel? The Flying Squirrel turned his head and saw that Vinsmoke Judge had come over at some point and handed him a glass of iced whiskey. It seems that Mr. Judge is speaking from his heart. The Flying Squirrel smiled and took the wine glass. Vinsmoke Judge shook his head, his eyes suddenly narrowed, and he lowered his voice and said. I heard that Commodore Darren caused a lot of earth-shaking events in the New World. The Flying Squirrel glanced at him and suddenly smiled. It's not a big deal, it's just that the headquarters of the Beast's pirates was annihilated. Vinsmoke Judge's eyelids twitched. As the commander of Germa 66, Vinsmoke Judge was naturally very clear about the strength of the Beast's pirates. One very important point is that one of the highest cadres of the Beast's pirates, Plague, Quinn, once worked with him in the same research team. He knew very well how terrifying the strength of the fat man who liked to wear weird overalls was. When he first heard the news, Vinsmoke Judge was a little bit unconvinced. After all, in his memory, although Darren's strength was abnormal, he would not be able to annihilate the headquarters of the Beast's pirates. But now that he has received confirmation from the Flying Squirrel, Vinsmoke Judge couldn't help but feel a chill in his spine. He was silent for a long time before he slowly uttered, "Commodore Darren is really the pride of our North Sea." The Flying Squirrel smiled, feeling that the time was almost right, and took the initiative to speak. "By the way, Mr. Judge, regarding the cooperation between our North Sea Fleet and Germa 66, Commodore Darren has a small proposal." Vinsmoke Judge frowned. "This guy, is he using Darren to pressure me?" He suppressed his inner dissatisfaction and said, "Admiral Flying Squirrel, please speak." The Flying Squirrel smiled and said, "Regarding the new weapons and warship transformation of our North Sea Fleet." Half a minute later, Vinsmoke Judge nodded cautiously. "It's not a big problem." He looked around and frowned. "Why hasn't that kid Doflamingo appeared yet? His face is really getting bigger and bigger." The tone was obviously dissatisfied. The Flying Squirrel smiled meaningfully. Maybe he was busy with something very important and was delayed. At the same time, the lobby of the Don Quixote family residence. All the powerful people in the North Sea are patiently waiting for the protagonist of the banquet. Don Quixote Doflamingo is slowly kneeling on one knee on the cold marble floor, bowing his head and kissing the back of a man's hand. He said respectfully, "Welcome back to the North Sea, my godfather. My physical condition has not been very good recently, I will adjust as soon as possible. Please help me, thank you very much." Chapter 152 Father and Son. The slightly dark and cold lobby of the residence. The chandelier emits a cold light, reflecting the shadows of people. "Dover, how have you been recently?" Darren sat down on the soft leather sofa without hesitation, crossed his legs, lit a cigar, and asked casually with a smile. Torrebel and other Don Quixote family cadres stood in the shadows trembling, not daring to breathe. The atmosphere was extremely depressing. They were small, carefully peeking at Darren's figure, the latter just sitting casually on the sofa. A terrifying sense of oppression came over him. It was like a lazy beast, which could burst out at any time and tear everyone present to pieces. This guy is getting more and more terrifying. Thinking of the rumors about Darren that he had heard from Senior during this period, and the latter's madness and bloodiness in the headquarters of the Beast's pirates. At this moment, Trebol and others no longer dared to have any rebellious thoughts towards Darren, only deep fear. Doflamingo calmly sat opposite Darren, took the gold-plated cigar thrown by the latter, bit it in his mouth, and smiled. "Thank you for your concern, Godfather. With the full support of Admiral Flying Squirrel, the family's business and power have developed quite well." Darren smiled and shook his head. "No, I don't care about the development of the Don Quixote family. I believe in your ability. Otherwise, I would not have been assured to hand over the underground world of the North Sea to you. I am more concerned about your growth. After all, you are my godson." He glanced at the blond boy in a pink feather coat in front of him, feeling the strength of the biomagnetic field he exuded. "Now it seems that you have not disappointed me. You have indeed grown a lot." He raised his hand and simply gestured a height, and smiled. "I still remember that when I left the North Sea a few months ago, you were only this tall. Now you are almost 1.8 meters tall." Darren was not too clear about Doflamingo's exact age. It was estimated that he was about 12 or 13 years old. However, the growth rate of a kid of this age is extremely fast, not to mention a natural, dark king, like Doflamingo. In Darren's opinion, Doflamingo at this time has undergone earth-shaking changes in both size and breadth compared to when he left the North Sea. Especially the strength of the biomagnetic field has become exponentially stronger. And the unruly momentum he exudes, as well as the coldness and brutality between his eyebrows, have gradually overlapped with the domineering, 7 warlords of the sea, in Darren's memory. No wonder even the flying squirrel can't sit still. This kid's growth is indeed a bit unbelievable. That's great. That's really great. Doflamingo pursed his lips and didn't say anything. On the surface, he remained calm, but in fact his heart was full of doubts, and he couldn't figure out what Darren meant by this sentence. Are you confused about your practice recently? Darren suddenly spoke, spitting out a dragon-like smoke from his mouth. Doflamingo raised his eyebrows. What does this mean? He suppressed his doubts and uneasiness and said slowly. It's not bad. I have been training hard. While working hard to develop the devil fruit, I have not neglected the training of physical fitness. Oh. Darren's mouth curled up. His figure disappeared on the sofa without any warning. Doflamingo's pupils shrank into needles in an instant, and the muscles all over his body were tensed at this moment. Like a taut bow, tightened to the extreme. An unprecedented sense of threat came over him, causing a layer of fine cold sweat on his back. Can't see clearly. Can't catch Darren's speed at all. In the blink of an eye, Doflamingo relied on his body's instinct to hook his 5 fingers into claws and subconsciously grab the void in front of him. Clang! Large sparks flew up, illuminating the black-haired Navy's arrogant and condescending face. 5 nearly transparent sharp threads firmly pressed against his open hand, reflecting a faint cold light under the light. Threads that were strong enough to cut through rock and steel could not cut through human flesh at this time. Young master. What do you want to do? Damn it. Treybol and others reacted at this time, and their faces suddenly changed as they drew out their weapons. Stop. Doflamingo suddenly stopped their actions coldly. A drop of cold sweat slowly slid down his cheek from his forehead, and the sunglasses reflected Darren's handsome face with a smile. Doflamingo looked at Darren deeply, and then laughed sinisterly. Very good, the reaction is quite good, and the strength. He tightened his 5 fingers at any time, and pulled the sharp threads lightly. In the almost frozen eyes of Torebel and others, the indestructible silk threads were pulled into twisted arcs by Darren's fingers. It has also improved a lot. Darren looked at the blond boy in front of him with satisfaction and smiled. It can be seen that you have not slacked off during this period. As your godfather, I am very pleased. Dover, you must remember that industry, business, management, power, territory. These seemingly high-ranking glitz are actually secondary. He pointed to the corridor leading to the banquet hall, and could faintly hear the clinking of glasses and toasts from there from time to time. Some people spend their whole lives rolling in the so-called power and glory. They claim to be successful and great, but in the eyes of the real strong, they are as humble as ants. Don't be blinded by the success in front of you. This sea is ultimately a cold jungle that follows the law of the jungle. Only with strong strength can you truly stand above the sky. Now, try to attack me. Taking advantage of this return to the North Sea, I can give you some guidance on your training. Otherwise, I am too unreliable as a godfather. Please everything, thank you very much. Chapter 153 Darren's Righteousness. Guide. My training. Doflamingo's eyes condensed when he heard this. A strange emotion gradually floated up from the bottom of his eyes. Is this guy serious? The monster of the Navy headquarters, who killed the world destroyer, Bondi Waldo, and annihilated the headquarters of the Beast's pirates, really wants to guide his own training. Doflamingo's first thought was that this guy had bad intentions. Although the two of them were nominally godfather and godson, and the Don Quixote family was also developing rapidly and expanding madly with the support of the North Sea Fleet at a speed that even he himself was shocked by. But Doflamingo knew very well that a cold-blooded guy like Darren did not trust him at all. The best proof was that the flying squirrel blocked the entire Rubeck Island with several warships armed to the teeth that day. He knew very well that if Darren really had any accidents in the New World, the flying squirrel would definitely give the order to fire without hesitation and wipe out the Don Quixote family from this sea area at all costs. Of course, Doflamingo did not trust Darren either. The two maintained this harmonious relationship on the surface, and used each other in this game of intrigue and deception. He licked his dry lips and raised a sneer at the corner of his mouth. "Are you sure, my godfather?" Darren smiled and said, "Of course, what can make a father more pleased than watching his son become stronger and grow up?" Doflamingo took a deep breath, and the veins on the back of his hands bulged and bulged instantly. His face was full of unruly madness, and the violent red light filled his eyes behind the sunglasses, and his hands swung out at the same time like claws. The grinning voice echoed in the empty hall of the resident. "The sword is coming, godfather." Swish. In an instant. It was as if countless invisible swords tore through the air, and the crisp sound of silk cracking exploded one after another. Silently. The ceiling, floor, and walls of the resident hall appeared with long and thin cuts at the same time. The coffee table between the two of them suddenly broke into pieces, and the cuts were as smooth as a mirror. Doflamingo launched a violent attack on the Commodore. 10 minutes later. The entire lobby of the station had become a mess. Countless cuts covered the walls and the floor like scratches, and the wine cabinet, wine glasses, coffee table, desk. No piece of furniture remained intact. Traybull and others looked at the man standing in the ruins and lighting a cigar with shocked eyes, and a huge wave of emotions was set off in their hearts. Huh. Darren exhaled a puff of smoke from his mouth, smiled and looked at his godson who was kneeling on one knee and panting, and said with a smile. "Do you understand now? Your devil fruit ability is well developed, but the timing of your attack is not ruthless enough. In terms of physical fitness, strength and speed need to be better honed. This is the foundation of everything. In addition, you should spend more time to master the close combat skills I just taught you. With your current strength, you may be invincible in the North Sea, but when you go to the Grand Line or even the New World, you will face despair that scares you." Doflamingo knelt there with a pale face, sweat on his forehead, cracked lips, and a blank look in his eyes. In deep shock. Too strong. Even if he tried everything, he couldn't do anything to Darren. He thought that the hard work during this period of practice would narrow the gap between him and this man. But it didn't. The back of the man in front of him was so tall and far away, and the shadow he cast was like a huge dark cloud pressing down on his head, making it hard for Doflamingo to breathe. What he couldn't believe the most was that Darren was actually guiding him. The analysis of each move, the practice of the Navy's 6 styles, the understanding of the development of the string fruit, the grasp of the timing of the attack. The precise and sharp insights like a scalpel made Doflamingo's understanding of his own practice actually give rise to a kind of cloud clearing and light seeking. After hearing Darren's words, he slowly came back to his senses, swallowed his saliva, and said with difficulty, "Thank you for the guidance of Godfather." Darren smiled. In the past, Doflamingo's practice was to cross the river by feeling the stones, and there was no systematic practice method. The people around him, such as Traybull, were even more of a bunch of crooked melons and jujubes. Although they were loyal to Doflamingo, there were not many places where they could help him. With Darren's vision and experience, it would be easy to guide the current Doflamingo. In the original plot, Doflamingo's combat power was limited to the vice-chairman of the Emperor, and he even lost to King Luffy in the end, largely because he lacked a qualified teacher. Kaido of the Beasts might have been able to take on this position, but Doflamingo chose cooperation instead of confrontation, so he could only stop at that level in the end. But now it's different. Under his guidance and beating, the young and unruly flamingo in front of him may soar into the sky, spread out its brilliant and magnificent wings, and shock the whole world. This is what I should do as a godfather. Darren paused. Grow up as soon as possible, Dov. He turned his head, and his deep eyes looked through the glass window at the endless sea in the distance. The cigar's swaying smoke blurred his cold and deep facial lines. Compared to the wonderful Grand Line, this mere North Sea is too small. I am looking forward to the day when you step into the Grand Line. When that happens, the whole world can't stop us. Doflamingo listened to these exciting and bold words, and his heart couldn't help but ignite a raging fire of ambition. He stared at Darren's profile in a daze, pursed his lips, clenched his fists, and said nothing. Darren retracted his gaze, smiled and patted his shoulder. "Go ahead, they're still waiting for you to show up." Doflamingo stood up slowly. He looked at Darren's back as he turned and was about to leave, and he suddenly gritted his teeth and said with courage that came out of nowhere, "Darren, why are you helping me? Don't underestimate me, I can see the killing intent in your eyes. You should also know very well. If I have the chance to kill you, I will definitely do it without hesitation." As soon as these words came out, Trable and others were struck by lightning, and their faces suddenly turned pale. They all took a breath of cold air. Darren's steps paused for a moment. He turned his head and smiled brightly at Doflamingo. "Very good, just keep the desire to kill me. Hatred is often the best motivation to become stronger, whether the target of this hatred is me, the world government, or even the celestial dragons and the 5 elders. It doesn't matter. As for why I want to help you." Darren blinked. "Do you know what the righteousness I uphold is?" Doflamingo was startled. "What is it?" The corners of Darren's mouth raised an unbridled arc little by little. "Because I think it would be fun. An abandoned prince, carrying a blood feud, takes revenge on his noble people. Isn't it interesting? Finally, happy birthday to you, my godson," Darren said with a smile at last, and then his figure disappeared from the spot. Only Doflamingo was left standing there blankly, motionless. After a long time. In the worried eyes of everyone in Trable. His eyes gradually regained their coldness. He suddenly laughed crazily. He laughed so hard that his whole body twitched, and tears oozed from the corners of his eyes. "Interesting. Really interesting. My respected godfather. Your justice." He stepped forward and walked towards the corridor step by step. "No one of you can leak the legitimacy of that guy, do you hear me?" The light and shadow of the spotlights in the corridor intertwined on Doflamingo's body, his pink feather coat fluttered as he walked forward, and his cold and domineering voice echoed in the lobby of the residence. Torrebel and others knelt on one knee at the same time, bowed their proud heads, and said respectfully, "Yes, young master." Doflamingo walked through the corridor expressionlessly, his pointed shoes stepped on the hard marble slabs, rippling out a crisp echo. As the door of the banquet hall got closer and closer, the sound of guests from major forces in the North Sea clinking glasses became clearer and louder. Doflamingo stood in the darkness, and the shadow covered his young face. Bang! He pushed the door open violently. The light and noise in the banquet hall were deafening, instantly drowning out his figure. With a false smile on his face, he walked up to meet the guests' enthusiastic gazes. He walked into the light. The birthday party of Don Quixote Doflamingo, the king of the North Sea underworld, ended in the revelry of the guests. 1 month later. North Sea. A deserted island. 10 million volts Thunderbird. A huge Thunderbird several meters high suddenly roared in the dense jungle. The blue wings made purely of boiling thunder constantly destroyed everything on the flight path, and towering trees fell one after another, raising huge waves of dust. The high temperature of thunder instantly ignited the jungle and vegetation, and fiery red flames spread on the ground, and thick black smoke rose. In the violent explosion, a tall figure suddenly shot out from the fire, and the military boots rubbed against the ground to form a long groove. Darren, with his upper body naked, was surrounded by wisps of black smoke, and several parts of his skin seemed to have been burned by lightning. But his eyes were full of enthusiasm, bursting with blazing light, biting a nearly burnt cigar in his mouth, laughing and saying, "Is this all you can do, flying squirrel? Can you do it?" A furious voice suddenly came from the distant direction. "Darren, you bastard, don't underestimate me." The moment the voice fell, in the center of the rising black smoke and flames, a faint electric light suddenly flew out and sank into the sky at an astonishing speed. Darren's eyes suddenly condensed. This feeling. He could clearly feel that the magnetic field within 100 meters around him suddenly fell into chaos and became violent. Could this move be? Darren seemed to remember something, and raised his head with a lively look. The sky was pitch black, and the boundless thunderclouds had gathered at some point. The dark sea of clouds was like a huge black vortex, constantly flowing and rolling, brewing terrifying power. 30 million volts. Thunder sanction. The next moment, a pillar of blue lightning fell from the sky like a pillar of light, and fell heavily towards Darren's position. Boom. The ground within a radius of 10 meters was instantly shattered, lifted, and evaporated. The fierce wind wrapped in hot air waves, sweeping everything like purgatory. The dazzling lightning occupied all vision at this moment, and the roaring storm spread out, pressing countless trees in the jungle to bow their heads, and those close to them were even uprooted. Boiling plasma poured everywhere from the point where the thunder fell. Under the impact of the lightning pillar, the figure of the Commodore stood arrogantly in place, with his arms open. A fierce smile on his face. The whole person seemed to be bathed in the magnificent Milky Way. After half a minute, the deserted island gradually returned to peace. The land was devastated, and the forest showed large areas of baldness. Many places were burning embers and billowing black smoke. In the center, a shocking charred huge pit lay there. All the obstacles around were turned into ashes under the scouring of thunder. Some of the gravel on the ground even formed crystals under extremely high voltage and high temperature, emitting a red and black luster. A faint arc of electricity jumped and flowed across the surface of the earth from time to time. The flying squirrel with a swollen nose and face staggered out of the forest. Looking at the exaggerated scene in front of him, his heart tightened and he subconsciously quickened his pace. Darren. He ran quickly to the center of the huge pit and saw the charred Commodore standing there motionless, like a blackened statue. A sense of panic surged in his heart. Could it be? Hey, Darren, are you okay? The flying squirrel's eyelids twitched wildly. The power of the thunder fruit far exceeded his expectations. Could he have killed Darren? Cough, cough, cough. But at this moment, the figure in front of him suddenly coughed violently, black smoke came out of his nostrils, and the slag of the burnt cigar came out of his mouth. I almost got into trouble. Flying squirrel. Darren shook the ashes on his head, took out a pack of cigarettes like nothing happened, and sighed. You are really amazing, flying squirrel. It seems that it is a right choice to give you the thunder fruit. You mastered this trick so quickly. While speaking, he took out a cigarette, bit it in his mouth, and picked up a hot crystal from the ground, burning. Hearing Darren's words, the flying squirrel couldn't help but straighten his chest. Darren was a monster, praised by Zephyr, Garp and Sengoku. Being recognized by him, the flying squirrel couldn't help but feel an unprecedented sense of pride. It can be seen that you are very compatible with the thunder fruit. Darren patted the flying squirrel on the shoulder and said with approval. I almost had to use the armed color domineering defense. The proud smile on the flying squirrel's face froze instantly. Please thank you for everything. Chapter 155 Dragon is in trouble. I find that you are really a bit annoying sometimes. The flying squirrel pouted and said a little sullenly. Oh. Darren shrugged and said casually, pretending not to hear the flying squirrel's complaints. After a month of special training, the strength of this guy flying squirrel has changed dramatically. In the past month, he has basically mastered the ability of the thunder fruit and can use it flexibly in different actual combat environments. Transform the body elements into lightning and move at high speed in the air or other conductive media. Release high-voltage thunder at a medium distance and hit the target accurately. Use the high temperature and penetrating characteristics of lightning itself to release powerful moves. In general, except for not mastering domineering, the current flying squirrel's comprehensive strength is definitely not inferior to the headquarters, lieutenant general, and even infinitely reaches the level of elite lieutenant general. After all, the advantages brought by the thunder fruit to the ability user are really unsolvable. As for the specific development direction of the thunder fruit, Darren did not give too many fantastic ideas, but simply pointed out a template for reference to the flying squirrel Enelu. Enelu, the god of the Sky Island, the ability user of the thunder fruit in the original plot. Although this guy was extremely unlucky to meet King Luffy, and was forced offline with the weird setting of, rubber is not conductive, it is undeniable that Enelu's development of the thunder fruit is still quite good. The most important point is that Enelu's development direction of the thunder fruit is easy to start with. This may be the underlying logic of the devil fruit. The development direction of any devil fruit actually has its regular formula. This is also supported in the original plot. For example, after Blackbeard took Whitebeard's tremor fruit, the move he used was the air shock that Whitebeard himself was good at. Another example is that Sabo, who has been taught by dragons since childhood and is proficient in close combat, the first move he mastered after obtaining the flame fruit was Fire Fist. The reason and logic behind this are actually not difficult to guess. Low difficulty to master. As for the positioning of Flying Squirrel, Darren did not intend to let him grow into a hexagonal player, like Sakaski, Kuzan, and Borsellino, who had no shortcomings. In the final analysis, Flying Squirrel's personal talent and potential were definitely not as good as those three monsters. So Darren's expectation for Flying Squirrel was an Enel 2.0 who was proficient in domineering, physical skills and swordsmanship. After all, Enel's own hard power was there, and the terrifying destructive power of the Thunder Fruit made him an unparalleled threat. In this way, the North Sea Fleet had a mobile humanoid disaster plus energy core. On the basis of Enel's template, coupled with his original proficiency in swordsmanship and physical skills, and mastering two-color domineering. Perhaps his fighting strength among the peak strongmen is still a little lacking, but he will definitely not be easily controlled in physical skills like Enel. That's enough. At least an entry-level admiral-level combat power is a sure thing. After all, to reach the top of the general's combat power, there are too many factors involved, such as talent, opportunity, coincidence, and fate. On my side, after a month of thunder body tempering, there has been a good improvement. Physique has increased by 3 points, strength and speed have increased by 1 point, and armament hockey has increased by 2 points in the process of beating the Flying Squirrel. As a result, Darren's own physical data has become like this. Physique, 82.812. Strength, 71.513. Speed, 71.899. Armament hockey, 39.035. Hegemony hockey, 52.301. However, as time goes by, the increase in physique by this thunder body tempering has gradually weakened a lot. Even Darren has begun to develop resistance to lightning. Now basically, electric shocks below 10 million volts will not have any effect on Darren. It may even produce a phenomenon similar to non-conductivity, where the current and plasma will flow directly along Darren's body surface and then splash out. It seems that thunder body tempering will not have any obvious effect in the short term. Darren used his perception talent to look at his data panel, and such a thought flashed through his mind. Perhaps as the Flying Squirrel further develops the intensity of lightning strikes and increases the voltage to 50 million volts, 100 million volts or even higher, the efficiency of thunder body tempering will be improved again. But now, Darren no longer needs to stay in wasting time in Beihai. How is the cooperation with Vinsmoke Judge going? Darren, who was smoking, suddenly asked. The Flying Squirrel was stunned and asked subconsciously. Are you going back to the headquarters? Darren nodded and smiled helplessly. Teacher Zepha has contacted me several times and scolded me in the Den Den Mushi. If I don't go back, he will probably come to Beihai to arrest me. Thinking of the old man Zepha's face in the Den Den Mushi, he had a headache. There are reasons. He also said that he found a very efficient practice method in Beihai. It would have been better if he hadn't said that. Once he did, Zephyr flew into a rage. What do you mean, kid? Do you think my teaching method is inefficient? Darren couldn't really say to him, yes, when I was in the prison of the Beast's pirates, the medicine I took to cough for a day was equivalent to half a month of training in the training camp, and it was about the same in the North Sea. If he really said that, he probably wouldn't have to stay in the headquarters. After returning to Marineford, there will definitely be no good results. Mr. Zephyr is doing this for your own good. It was rare to see Darren with a bitter look on his face. The flying squirrel laughed with some gloating, and then said, "There has been no obvious technological progress in the engine modification of the warship, but the laser weapon has produced results. According to Vinsmoke Judge, Germa 66 has successfully analyzed the energy core structure of the laser weapon. I believe that it will be successfully modified in a while." "Yeah." Darren nodded. He raised his head and looked at the sunset reflected in the sea of clouds in the distance. The air was freezing cold, and snowflakes gradually fell from the sky. The climate of this sea is so strange. It was snowing, but there was such a magnificent sunset. The white snowflakes, reflected by the sunset, looked gorgeous and beautiful. Darren's eyes were dazed for a moment, and he smiled. "This year is about to end, and I should go back." The flying squirrel smiled and blinked. "That's right, I have to reunite with my family at the end of the year." Darren smiled and was about to say something when the slightly hurried call of the military Den Den Mushi suddenly sounded. "Bulu Bulu. Bulu Bulu." The flying squirrel looked at Darren's action of taking out the Den Den Mushi and said mischievously, "Maybe Miss Shi is calling you home." During this month, he also roughly knew that Darren brought a woman back to his family compound. "Get lost." Darren rolled his eyes unhappily and cursed with a smile. The flying squirrel raised his hands, laughed and walked back a few steps. Darren then connected to the Den Den Mushi. Standing not far away, the flying squirrel found that the smile on Darren's face quickly disappeared, replaced by a deep solemnity. After he hung up the Den Den Mushi call, the flying squirrel walked over quickly. What happened? The sunset glow was completely covered by the sea of clouds at this time, and darkness gradually engulfed the earth. The world was snowing heavily, and the cold penetrated into the bone marrow. Darren licked his chapped lips and suddenly let out a long breath. "Drager is in trouble," he said. Before the flying squirrel continued to ask questions, Darren said a hoarse voice that made him feel cold all over. "He killed a celestial dragon at the junction of the North Sea and the Grand Line." The low voice of the Commodore seemed to penetrate the heavy snow. "In full view of the public. Ask for everything, grateful." Chapter 156 Kill on the Spot. Glittering snowflakes fell from the sad sky, landing on the flying squirrel's hair, cheeks and body, but he seemed to be unaware of it. He stood there motionless as if struck by lightning, his eyes widened, and his contracted pupils trembled violently. He couldn't believe his ears. Monkey D. Dragon. The blood of the Navy's hero, Garp. The monster of the Navy headquarters. The idol in the minds of countless young Navy. The future admiral and even the admiral of the Navy. The legendary Rear Admiral Dragon actually killed a world noble celestial dragon in full view of the public. If this news hadn't come from Darren's mouth, the flying squirrel wouldn't have dared to believe that this was really happening. It's hard to imagine what kind of storm this incident will set off in the Navy. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but look at Darren again. Speaking of killing the celestial dragons. Darren, so what does the headquarters mean? The flying squirrel rolled his throat and asked with difficulty. Darren's eyebrows were twisted into knots at this time. After a moment of silence, he suddenly shook his head. Just now, General Zhang Guo personally gave me an order, asking me to give up all the affairs on hand and go to the scene to carry out the arrest operation. General Zhang Guo means, because the incident happened in the North Sea, it belongs to my original jurisdiction and I am more familiar with the nearby waters, so it is the best choice for me to carry out the arrest mission. His original words were, we must do everything we can to stop Dragon's escape, if necessary. Darren paused. You can kill him on the spot. As soon as these words came out, the flying squirrel took a breath of cold air. Has the situation become so bad? At this moment, the flying squirrel's brain was in a mess. He was not too familiar with Dragon, but he had met him before, and he had a good impression of the former's natural and friendly leadership and strong sense of justice. Such a promising naval idol ended up drawing swords with his colleagues. It was not a good feeling to think about it. What are you going to do? The flying squirrel looked at Darren, who had relit a cigarette, and he was anxious and couldn't help asking. If I remember correctly, Dragon should be your good friend, right? Darren shook his head. Not a good friend, but the relationship is still okay. As for what to do, I'm not very clear now. The image of Drago lying drunk in his yard that day flashed through his mind. His eyes suddenly darkened. But no matter what, I have to go. He took a deep puff of his cigarette, and as he exhaled the smoke, he threw the cigarette butt on the ground and stomped it out. The metal wrist guard on his arm instantly opened into a streamlined silver skateboard, hovering steadily in front of his eyes. Darren stepped on it with an inexplicable cold light in his eyes. Although he didn't know the reaction of Vice Admiral Garp, with the character of General Sengoku, he might forcibly block the news or take coercive measures directly. Thinking of this, a violent magnetic field suddenly burst out from his body, pushing the metal skateboard with incomparable the terrifying speed roared up. In less than a second, the speed had broken the sound barrier, and in the blink of an eye, it passed through the heavy snow and disappeared into the sea of clouds in the distance. The fierce wind spread on the land of the deserted island, rolling up countless snowflakes. The flying squirrel stood there, motionless in the wind, tightly pursing his lips. He suddenly felt the cloak on his shoulders. It was extremely heavy. Marine Headquarters, Marineford. The Admiral's office. Sengoku, you damn bastard. Garp's furious roar almost shattered the wall of the office. He stared at the gloomy Sengoku in front of him, panting, his eyes filled with ferocious bloodshot. What's the matter with this arrest warrant? That's my son. Bang. Zongguo suddenly stood up and slammed his hand on the desk, so hard that the desk was broken into pieces. Of course I know that's your son. He roared with a sullen face. Do you know what your son did? A celestial dragon. He killed a damn celestial dragon. He killed a celestial dragon in public. Do you know how many witnesses there were in that town? Hundreds of people saw him crush a celestial dragon's head like tofu. Garp said angrily with bloodshot eyes. He was protecting civilians. Even so, you can't do anything to celestial dragons. Warring States almost bit his teeth to pieces, and the words popped out from between his teeth. Garp, do you know how serious the nature of this incident is? A navy. And not an ordinary navy, but you. The biological son of the hero, Garp, the future admiral of the navy. Killed a celestial dragon. Such a situation has never happened in the history of the navy for so many years. The most important thing is, if this matter is not handled well, how will the world government view our navy? Once suspicion arises, nothing can be repaired. The world government is already furious, and the 5 elders have directly issued a death order to me, and action must be taken as soon as possible. Now I am officially giving you an order in the name of the Admiral of the Navy Headquarters. Before this incident is over, you, Monkey D. Garp, are not allowed to leave Marineford. Don't even think about messing around. Darren has already rushed to the scene. The warships of Sakaski and Borsellino also left the headquarters, naval port 10 minutes ago. No matter what you want to do, it's too late. Oh, really? Garp laughed in anger. A deep and majestic aura like the abyss of the sea gradually rose in his body, and the faint black and red lightning bloomed in the void. Then let's see if you, the so-called Admiral of the Navy, can stop me. Zongguo's face sank, and his body began to release dazzling golden light. But at this moment, Garp, that's enough. A hoarse, low, old voice suddenly sounded behind Garp. Garp was shocked. The moment he heard the voice, his eyes quickly dimmed as if a balloon had been punctured. The aura that was rising wildly on his body suddenly stagnated, and then receded like a tide. A deep sense of powerlessness occupied his body. He turned around with difficulty. A broad and burly figure stood there. Old Man Kong. The steel-boned Kong with a mohawk hairstyle looked at Garp calmly, and then nodded to Zongguo. The command of the arrest mission is now in your hands, Sengoku. After saying that, he turned his head and said to Garp. You should know that I will not let you go to sea. He stared at Garp's bloodshot pupils with a stern look, and said word by word. You're the hero of the Navy, and you represent more than just yourself. The words uttered by the Admiral of the Navy were like cold nails, piercing Garp's heart, causing the blood and anger on his face to fade quickly, and his face gradually turned pale. If you take action in this incident, the entire Navy will be implicated because of your stupidity. Add more, ask for everything, thank you very much. Chapter 157. It's too difficult. Navy Headquarters, Marineford. Marshal's Mansion. The Marshal's office is very quiet. Stay here until this incident is over, Garp. Steelbone Sora sat behind his desk, calmly dealing with the piles of documents in front of him, and said without raising his head. Garp stood there in despair, motionless, like a sculpture without a soul. On the gray-white wall hung a plaque with the words, Jung X. The two black characters looked down at him, as if putting a mountain-like weight on his shoulders. It started raining outside the window at some point. The dark clouds were like a huge hood, covering the earth tightly, pressing people so hard that they seemed to be unable to breathe. The drifting cold rain crackled against the closed glass window, and then bounced out, shrouding the whole world with gloom and murder. Garp looked through the glass window at the naval port in the distance with his eyes blank. On the huge oval naval port, the elite Navy troops wearing hooded coats patrolled back and forth in the cold rain, looking murderous. He noticed that there was no warship docked in the naval port. Don't look at it. I have ordered all warships to temporarily go out to sea for patrol. You won't have any chance. Steel Kong's low voice came slowly. The numb-looking Garp twitched his mouth and smiled bleakly. This decisive courage is worthy of Old Man Kong. So, Old Man Kong, is there really no hope? Garp's slightly pale lips trembled, and he murmured with difficulty. Steel Kong did not raise his head, his eyelids drooped. As he flipped through the documents in his hand, he said casually. Garp, you are my most proud student, but also my most troublesome student. You should know that I am always proud of having you as my student. As for that kid Drago, I really admire him. A strong sense of justice, a convincing personality, natural leadership, outstanding strategy, powerful strength and amazing talent. Even if you look at the hundreds of years of history of the Navy, it is difficult to find a young man who can be compared with him. Garp gritted his teeth with red eyes and said. Then please save him. His clenched fists trembled uncontrollably, and he took a step forward. An irrepressible pleading expression appeared on his face, which was always free and cheerful. He's only 25 years old. He told me that he wanted to be a Navy admiral. He wanted to change this terrible world in the name of righteousness. Damn it, I should have heard it at that time. Garp covered his face with his palms and gritted his teeth, but the hot tears could not stop flowing out from between his fingers. Steelbone Kong finally stopped turning the pages. He raised his head and looked at the Navy hero who was choking in front of him with a calm expression. The middle-aged Garp in front of him gradually overlapped with the grinning little devil in his mind. Steelbone Kong suddenly sighed. Garp, it's not that I don't want to take action. But you should be very clear about the consequences of killing a celestial dragon, not to mention in public. The severity and sensitivity of this incident have far exceeded the capabilities of Sengoku and me. A hint of powerlessness flashed in his eyes. According to the regulations of the world government, once the world's noble celestial dragons are harmed, the admiral of the Navy must attack unconditionally. But do you know why Sengoku didn't deal with this matter personally? Garp was stunned, his eyes blank. Kyori Sora took a cigar from the cigar box on the table, bit it in his mouth and lit it. The thick smoke lingered around his resolute and deep face. He said something that surprised Garp. Because this is the order of the 5 elders. Kyori Sora leaned back on the chair, raised his head slightly, and exhaled a stream of smoke from his mouth. Because of the sensitivity of Dragon's identity, the government has questioned the loyalty of our Navy's top brass. Can you imagine it? The blood of the Navy's hero, a future admiral or even a marshal, a soldier who should be the most loyal to the government, actually dared to attack the noble celestial dragons. This is unacceptable to the 5 elders. This is not just a problem with Dragon himself, his behavior has seriously affected the government's trust in our Navy, attitude and trust. Garp's face turned very pale. His concern for his son's life made him never think of the impact and involvement behind this incident. He opened his mouth and was about to say something. But Kong Gang waved his hand and interrupted him. The 5 elders have said that if our Navy lets Dragon run away this time, the government will directly cut 50% of the Navy's military expenditure. In addition, the promotion plan that the old man and Sengoku had already finalized has also been stopped. Before solving this incident and regaining the trust of the 5 elders, Sengoku cannot be the Navy Admiral, and I cannot go to the Holy Land to be the Commander-in-Chief of the world government. Garp was struck by lightning. Unprecedented guilt hit his heart. He staggered back 2 steps, his lips opened and closed. Kong, old man. Steel Kong smiled indifferently. It doesn't matter, I wasn't interested in the so-called commander-in-chief of the army. Zhang didn't have any complaints about this. So Garp, do you understand now? Whether it's the commander-in-chief of the army or the admiral of the navy, if we can save Dragon, even if there is only a slight chance, we will not give up easily. But the situation in front of us is too difficult. Your kid made an irreversible mistake. Hearing this, Garp could no longer speak. He stood there in a daze, as if his body and flexibility were swallowed by a huge cold and emptiness, and he lost all feeling. So, that stinky boy, is he really hopeless? Even Sakazuki and Borsellino have set off. He murmured. Sakazuki and Dragon have always been at odds, and he will never hold back. As for Borsellino, that guy's thoughts are always unpredictable. If the 2 of them join forces, even if Dragon is strong, he can't survive. No. He suddenly clenched his fists. But just as he was about to do something, Cyborg Kong's cold shout interrupted him. What do you want to do? Garp gritted his teeth with reluctance. Old Kong, I will definitely repay your kindness in the future, but Dragon is my son after all. I will save him no matter what. I know your position is very difficult, and I also know the difficulties of Zhang, so. He raised his hand and grabbed the navy cloak on his shoulders, and pulled it hard to make wrinkles. This navy, I don't. Bang. A fist knocked him back and smashed deeply into the wall. Garp looked at the sudden attack of Steel Bone Kong with a confused face, his head was dizzy, and a streak of blood flowed on his forehead. Idiot. Garp scolded sharply. I said it was difficult, but I didn't say I wouldn't do it. Garp said in astonishment. Kosakowski and Borsellino. Do you know why the first person Zhang notified was Darren? Steel Kong rolled his eyes in annoyance and started to curse. Garp was stunned. He seemed to understand something, and his dark eyes full of bloodshot eyes were filled with light again. Please thank you for everything. Chapter 158 Comrade or Enemy. Be patient, Garp. Looking at Garp, who was a little calmer but still pacing back and forth anxiously, Steel Kong sighed and spoke. Garp paused and asked anxiously. Old man Kong, do you think Darren can arrive earlier than Sakazuki and Borsellino? What if Sakazuki finds Dragon first, the situation will be out of control. Kimball Kong didn't look nervous. His eyebrows revealed his usual calmness and fortitude. He pondered for a while, and under Garp's expectant eyes, he slowly shook his head and said in a hoarse voice. Darren is more familiar with the situation in the North Sea than all of us. Although Sakazuki and Borsellino have also served in the North Sea, don't forget that the one who really has the highest control over the North Sea is Darren, the King of the North Sea. He won't let you down. After hearing Kimball Kong's judgment, Garp breathed a sigh of relief. That's good, that's good. He murmured over and over again. When it comes to the danger of his son's life, his performance at this time is completely different from the hot-blooded and reckless Navy hero in the past. Instead, he became cautious and uneasy. But, are you ready? Cyborg asked coldly. Garp was stunned, looking at Cyborg without knowing why, and met the latter's serious eyes. From today on, your son will become the biggest enemy of the world government. And even our navy. No, Dragon has a strong sense of justice and will never be an enemy of our navy. This has nothing to do with his personal will. Cyborg interrupted Garp coldly. No matter what he wants to do in the future, from the moment he killed the celestial dragon, he is destined to embark on a path that cannot be turned back. He will definitely stand on the opposite side of the world government and our navy. There is no doubt that even if we put aside his powerful strength and talent, Dorag knows too much about our sea. He is familiar with our Navy's personnel, combat power, fleet deployment, base layout, intelligence network distribution and even the encryption method of military Den Mushi communications. And now, the fact that he has defected is inevitable. I am afraid that the world government will issue him an unprecedented huge reward. Your son will become the most sinister criminal in the world. So, are you ready to face all this, Garp? Steel Bone Kong's aggressive questioning made Garp's face change slightly. His son will become his enemy. This thought kept echoing in Garp's mind like a nightmare. He stood there, struggling for a long time, and then took a deep breath, clenched his fists and gritted his teeth and said, I am ready, Marshal Kong. Very good. Kimbolt Sora smiled with satisfaction. He reached out and picked up the military Den Mushi in front of him and dialed a signal. Brew brew. Brew brew. Just as the Den Mushi called, Kimbolt Sora stood up from his chair and walked out the door. When he passed by Garp, he paused for a moment, raised his hand and patted the former's shoulder, and whispered. Now, think about what you want to say to Dragon in the end, Darren will help you tell it. After that, Kimbolt Sora walked out of the office directly. He left enough space for Garp's final farewell. Brew. At this time, the Den Mushi communication was connected. Marshal Sora, I'm Darren. A low voice came from there, and there was a faint sound of howling wind around. Garp stared at the Den Mushi in a daze, and took a step with great difficulty. He walked over step by step. Darren, it's me, kid. He hissed. The Den Mushi paused for a second, and Darren's voice came out again. But this time the background wind sound disappeared, and it became quiet and solemn. Vice Admiral Garp, you say. Garp's lips trembled, his eyes were blank, and turbid tears flowed from the corners of his eyes. He suddenly grinned. Tell that kid to stay alive. Dash 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 dash. Dash 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 dash. Draeger's hands were shaking. Even though it had been more than half a day since the incident, his blood-stained hands were still shaking. The military uniform and cloak that he was proud of in the past had to be abandoned, replaced by a military green hooded coat that covered most of his face. He tried hard to recall the reconnaissance and counter-reconnaissance knowledge he learned in the military academy, erased his whereabouts as much as possible, secretly boarded a ship of an inconspicuous caravan, and came to this island. Continue to stay in this sea area. It's not a very good solution. With the huge power of the world government, it's only a matter of time for them to find their tracks. As a former Corps General of the Navy headquarters, with his unique identity and background, Drago is very familiar with the group of CP lackeys under the world government. Those cruel and violent beasts have very sensitive noses. We must find a way to go to the Grand Line, or even the New World. Only in that vast and endless chaotic sea can we take a short breath in the endless pursuit and find that slim ray of hope. Brain. His thoughts were in a mess, like a tangled ball of thread. Draeger was walking on the busy commercial street, feeling a little confused. The noise, bustle and crowds around him made him feel at a loss. He subconsciously tightened his hooded coat, as if the not-so-bright sunlight made it difficult for him to open his eyes. He still remembered the bloody smell at that time. The stench of sweat, strong alcohol and gunpowder, as well as screams, broken sounds, cries and grim smiles. Recalling that moment not long ago, when the anger in his heart surged. He could no longer control. Can't help myself. There is no interval between making a decision and executing the action. So the result was revealed. That hideous face changed from arrogant to terrified and begging for mercy in an instant, and then his head exploded like a watermelon in front of his eyes. What kind of feeling is that? Drag couldn't figure it out now. Licking his cracked lips, he wrapped his hood tightly, found a roadside tavern on the street, and asked the boss for a bottle of wine in a low voice. He sat down at the table under the shade of the tree. Are you alone? The boss quickly brought a bottle of wine and asked with a smile, not surprised by the guest wrapped in a hooded coat on a hot day. Drag was about to nod, but he said strangely. 2 cups, thank you. The boss smiled and put down the 2 cups, then turned and left. Doriger sat there quietly, staring at the dark green wine in front of him. He didn't drink it. As if he was waiting for something. Waiting for someone. Maybe to say a few words, or to say a final goodbye. It doesn't matter who it is. He waited patiently. 1.1 minute. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Half an hour. Sitting quietly under the shade of the tree, he felt uneasy and uneasy. It was as if there was an invisible curtain in the world, completely isolating him from the busy streets next to him. A full hour passed. A voice suddenly sounded in front of him. The most domineering wine cannot be drunk alone. Draeger suddenly breathed a sigh of relief. For him, this hour was like waiting for fate to reveal the answer. And now he finally waited. I didn't expect that the First Navy to find me was you. He raised his head and looked at the man in front of him who was slowly holding up the bottle of sherry, wine, and laughed sincerely. His eyes were slightly red from laughing. Darren filled 2 glasses with wine, then looked up and looked at Doriger, smiling. The North Sea is my territory. I'm grateful for everything. Chapter 159 Claws that crush the power. The North Sea is my territory. Under the shade of the tree, the Commodore's voice with a faint smile revealed unparalleled dominance and confidence. Drag was startled when he heard the words, and then he couldn't help laughing. Yes, I almost forgot that you are the world-famous, King of the North Sea. I don't know if it was an illusion, but the moment he saw Darren appear in front of him, Derek's uneasy and confused heart suddenly became stable. It was as if he was relieved from the bottom of his heart when he saw his best friend arrive in time before death or in despair. Looking at Darren, who was dusty and tired on his face, Derek couldn't help but think about how far he had rushed to get to him before others. So his smile became even brighter. The shade of the tree slowly fluttered in the moist breeze, and the sun cast mottled light and shadows on the ground. The two sat opposite the wine table and didn't speak for a while. It seemed to be in sharp contrast with the lively, noisy and bustling crowds on the street. Stop grinning like a fool. Darren suddenly said unhappily. He pushed the full glass of wine in front of Dorag. Then he picked up his own glass of wine and took a sip to relieve the dry mouth and fatigue caused by the long journey. You shouldn't be so impulsive. The smile on Dorag's face suddenly withdrew. Darren saw him like this and sighed. One of us has to speak up about this. Darren was silent for a while, pursed his lips, looked down at his hands that were still stained with blood, and whispered. I couldn't control myself at the time. After whispering this sentence softly, an unspeakable bitterness filled his eyes. How bad is the situation? Very bad. Darren shook his head and said bluntly. Vice Admiral Garp has been banned from leaving the headquarters, and the port of Marineford has been completely blocked. The government's top brass has issued a death order to the headquarters, and you must be arrested and killed on the spot if necessary. Except for me, both Sakaski and Borsellino have gone out to sea. I believe they will find this place soon. Boom. Suddenly, there were bursts of dull thunder in the distance of the sky. Gusts of wind blew on the streets, and large patches of dark clouds began to gather above the head. The fallen leaves were blown down by the wind, and the footsteps of pedestrians gradually hurried. The sun was dim and the sky was gloomy. Heavy rain is coming. Derek's cracked lips were pursed tighter. Darren was not in a hurry, but just waited quietly. That's a child. After a long while, Derek spoke in a hoarse voice. His voice was very low, revealing an indescribable grief and helplessness, echoing in the corners of the street where pedestrians were in a hurry. His kite accidentally landed on the mount of the celestial dragons, and the silk thread of the kite accidentally cut his robe. It only cut a little corner of his clothes. He should have paid compensation and apologized, but the celestial dragons wanted his life. The little boy's parents knelt on the ground and begged for mercy. Their heads were broken and blood flowed all over the ground. But it was useless. I happened to be there at the time. Although I had never really met the celestial dragons before, I had heard more or less about the extremely bad rumors about them, but I still couldn't believe it at the time. No matter how bad people are, how bad can they be? So I stepped forward, stated my identity, and was willing to apologize for the little boy. This was originally a small matter, at least that's what I thought. But I found out that I was wrong, I was very wrong. I deeply underestimated their evil. It turns out that there are really devils in this world. At this point, Dorag almost laughed at himself. After hearing my identity, the celestial dragon laughed in anger and ordered to kill the whole family. Darren, I don't understand. Why did he have to take their lives for such a small matter? Dorag looked up blankly and looked at Darren. Darren didn't say anything. He took out a pack of wrinkled cigarettes from his pocket, took out a cigarette and lit it. Happy families are always similar, but unhappy families have their own misfortunes. This is common sense. But the absurd thing is that when facing the supreme, celestial dragon, unhappy families have similar endings. For some people, they will hurt or even deprive others of their lives as a symbol of their power. Darren looked at Dorag through the drifting smoke with calm eyes and whispered. So you killed him? Dorag nodded with difficulty. Yes, I killed him. Only in this way can we stop all this from happening. As if the shock of killing the celestial dragon had not completely subsided, his face changed and his breathing became rapid. I didn't dare to leave myself any room to think and hesitate, because I was afraid that if I hesitated, I would lose my courage. At that time, my brain was blank, and I felt my chest was extremely hot, as if something was about to explode. I couldn't help but vomit. When I came to my senses, the surroundings were already in chaos. Some people were screaming, some were running away, and some were so scared that they fainted. And the guy who called himself God had his head crushed by me. It was as easy as crushing a watermelon. I couldn't believe it at the time. It turned out that the Tianlong people would die if they were killed. He didn't know whether he smiled sarcastically or confusedly. So gods can die too. But you know, Darren, before I made my move, I was actually very scared. Really scared. I know I'm a Navy, I can't make a move against the celestial dragons. Once I make a move, everything I have will be wiped out. Darren raised his eyebrows. Do you regret it? No. Drag grinned. Because the moment I crushed the celestial dragon's head, I woke up. With the blood splattering, a feeling of exhilaration that I've never had before surged into my brain. That feeling is really refreshing. Can you understand, Darren? Darren was silent for a moment, and slowly said. I understand. No, you don't understand. Drag interrupted Darren. I hope you don't understand either. Darren thought to himself that I really understand. But before he could say anything, Darren suddenly raised his right hand, which was still stained with blood. The 5 fingers were slightly bent. The middle finger and index finger are put together, and the ring finger and pinky finger are put together to form a 3-finger dragon claw posture. Do you still remember this move? Darren nodded and said. Dragon claw fist. Drag's eyes lit up and he smiled. Yes, dragon claw fist. Your reminder at that time made me create this physical technique. But do you know? In fact, after that day, I have been studying how to maximize the power of this move. But no matter how I try, I feel as if something is missing. But at the moment when I attacked the Tianlong man, I subconsciously used this move, but I found what the dragon claw fist has always been missing. He took a deep breath. It's the soul. It's the will. Dragon claw fist, it doesn't use the power of fingers alone, but the power of the so-called claw. This is the claw, trained to crush the tyrannical and overbearing power. As soon as the voice fell, a thunder suddenly came from the sky full of dark clouds. The pale lightning briefly illuminated the dark sky. The dark, dragon claw, covered with armed color domineering flashed a domineering and majestic cold light under the reflection of the lightning. Katakana middle dot katakana middle dot katakana middle dot. I ask for everything, thank you very much. Chapter 160 I don't blame them. How about it, my move is very powerful, right? Drag tried to laugh at Darren with sunshine. But he failed. There was only sadness and loss in his smile. In the flickering lightning in the sky, it looked bleak. Darren noticed this keenly. He frowned and suddenly asked. This story is not over yet, right? Darren smiled reluctantly. Yes, this story is not over yet. He has not finished yet. The strong wind before the heavy rain swept through the streets, blowing up countless fallen leaves on the ground. It also blew up the hood covering Darren's face. Darren's pupils shrank slightly. Darren's appearance has not changed much from before. His nose is high, his eyes are deep, his lines are deep and clear, and his black hair looks messy. The only thing is a new scar. The scar is on his left face, splashing out like an umbrella, with some festering blood and flesh, and traces of burns. Gunshot wound. Darren was slightly stunned. Suddenly. It's him. It's the latest wanted criminal by the world government. Monkey D. Dragon. Why is he here? Damn it. Don't move. Notify the Navy. Frightened, angry, hesitant, and fearful voices rang out from the street. As Dragon's hood was blown away, the pedestrians recognized him with horror. The whole street fell into chaos in an instant. Some people fled with their children with pale faces. Some people's eyes showed greed, and they raised their pistols tremblingly, pointing the guns at Dragon. Some people tried to use the Den Den Mushi in the phone booths and shops to inform the local government and navy, but were surprised to find that all the Den Den Mushi could not connect to any signal. Faced with all this, Dragon sat there as if he didn't notice it, just smiling calmly at Darren. So that's it, I understand. Darren's eyes flashed, his fists clenched unconsciously, and there was a faint arc on the surface of his skin. With your strength, if you are on guard, even the CP members with Seastone bullets can't hurt you. If so, there is only one explanation. Yes. Dorad couldn't help but smile a little sadly, and then finish the story. After I killed the celestial dragon, I easily dealt with the CP guards. But when I turned around, I saw an incredible scene. Civilians on the street fled in panic, some called the Navy, and some broke down and cried, but none of this was important. Drag paused here, finally took a sip from the wine glass, choked and coughed violently, his face flushed slightly. He panted. The parents of the little boy I rescued, they trembled in fear and picked up the pistol of one of the CP members. The smile on the corner of his mouth was a bit absurd. Aim at me. Something seemed to break suddenly in the air. Silence fell. Boom. Another pale thunder tore through the dark sky, and the roar was deafening. Just like now. Darren glanced at the crowd around him expressionlessly. They were watching, coveting, and fearing. Some of them were running away, while others picked up guns. Glanced at by the Commodore's cold eyes, the civilians who were about to shoot dropped their pistols and fled in panic. I don't understand, Darren. I'm clearly standing up for them, I'm protecting them, they shouldn't be afraid of me. Darren's eyes were red, and his expression was a little incomprehensible. I'm clearly doing a good thing, I'm clearly a righteous Navy. Darren took a puff of cigarette and said slowly. Yes, good people should be pointed at by guns. Darren whispered. They kept saying, I'm sorry, to me, and I tried to go up to them to calm their emotions. But they still shot after all. Darren suddenly said. Dragon was silent. Yes. Because you were not prepared, and you didn't expect them to really shoot. Yes. Do you know why they shot? I know, they don't want to die. Darren sneered. Yes, they don't want to die. Drag killed the celestial dragons. As the parties involved, they must kill Dragon to atone for their sins, in order to survive. Even if Dragon killed the celestial dragons to save them. How absurd the world is. Drag suddenly let out a long breath and smiled. This smile revealed a bit of freedom and relief. I don't blame them. I know. They are just ordinary people. They have their own lives. They just want to live a peaceful life and live their lives steadily. They are also protecting themselves and their families. I don't blame them. This is what they should do. They have already said sorry to me. But at the moment I was shot, I understood a truth. Those people who kneeled down in front of the celestial dragons were not kneeling for the so-called power, but for this damn, terrible world. The corrupt system, the despicable morality, the selfish human heart. The existence of the celestial dragons is just a freak created by all these chaos. While speaking, Dorag looked at a corner of the street in a trance. Darren followed his gaze. A woman was sitting on the muddy and dirty roadside, Her face was pale from hunger, her face was haggard, and her clothes were tattered. She was holding a rag-like thing in her arms. It was a child. Less than 5 meters away from her was a luxuriously decorated restaurant. Looking through the huge floor-to-ceiling glass windows, all the customers in the restaurant had fled because of the commotion caused by Dorag's appearance. There were only tables of hot, expensive and exquisite meals left. Dorag looked at the food, then at the hungry woman, pursed his lips, and whispered. "Did you see that, Darren? This is the truth of this world. The celestial dragons are arrogant and extravagant. They need money, so they squeeze the major member states. The politicians and nobles of the member states squeeze the landlords and businessmen, and they also squeeze ordinary civilians. Numbers countless people, they just stay at the bottom of this society forever, hungry, some become beggars, some become thieves, some become prostitutes, some become gamblers. But more people become pirates. These poor and pathetic people, just surviving has already used up all their energy." Drager smiled again. "So I really don't blame them for shooting me. In fact, I understand that whoever can win will help them, but I haven't really won yet." This time Darren saw it. There is no more sadness and disappointment in Darren's smile. There is only relief and a touch of self-blame buried in the bottom of his heart. Not just them, everything we see before our eyes, disasters, hunger, disputes, are the epitome of the future of the world. In this world of survival of the fittest, happiness will never stop. Drager looked at Darren seriously and said in a deep voice word by word. "One day, I will change this world." Hearing this, Darren couldn't help but sigh in his heart. In his mind, he couldn't help but recall the scenes of Dorag making noises and getting drunk in his yard that day. It's only been 2 months since we last met, but Dorag's face has obviously become more mature. The original innocent, cheerful and passionate temperament is almost gone, replaced by a kind of free and easy and heroic that sees through the essence of the world. Now he is a real man. It's just that. He will eventually go back to his original path. Most fan fictions only write about the revolutionary Dorag, but I want to write about his story before he became a revolutionary. The change of mentality, the transformation of spirit. His experience, his life. This is also the reason why I, Lao Ma, chose such an early timeline. Because everyone should have their story. There are only 2 chapters today, and the plot here is more difficult to write. Please do everything, and wish you all the best. Chapter 161 Farewell. The streets were still in a mess. Civilians were running away in panic, trying to frantically dial Denmushi. Darren and Dorag were still sitting there as if they were completely isolated from the chaos outside. The thunder was getting louder and louder, and lightning and thunder were flashing in the dark sky. Darren looked at Dorag's scarred face calmly and suddenly asked, "What are you going to do?" Dorag scratched his head, seeming a little embarrassed. "I don't know, but I have to escape from you first, right? The order you received should be to arrest me at all costs, or even kill me on the spot, right? But if there is a chance to escape, I want to create a brand new organization. An organization built and supported by harmony, freedom, equality and dreams. I need more people." He looked at Darren and smiled helplessly. "Originally, I wanted to invite you, but then I realized that you couldn't join. The North Sea Fleet, the chief of the training camp. Your layout and planning in the Navy over the years, as well as your personality, destined you to not agree to be my companion." Darren said jokingly. "Of course. Sleeping in the open, being hunted, and living in fear. I can't get used to the days without beauties, cigars and strong liquor." The two smiled at each other. Everything is self-evident. Another long while. Darren finished smoking the cigarette. He extinguished the cigarette butt and suddenly said, "Drago, this is a very difficult road. I know. No one will understand you. I know. Even those people you want to protect will be afraid of you, and you may even shoot you in the back at any time and hand you over to the world government." "Yeah, I know." Darag smiled brightly. This time it was really bright. It was the kind of bright smile that put aside thoughts and inner ambitions, and bravely faced the bleakness of life and the remoteness of ideals. Darren, this world needs a thorough change. I know they are just afraid, and this fear will continue, but I can't stop the change because of the fear and weakness of the general public to change. Darren smiled. It seems that you have made all the psychological preparations. Derek nodded. Darren smiled with satisfaction. Very good, before we start, Vice Admiral Garp asked me to tell you a message. Derek was stunned. He asked me to tell you. Darren repeated Garp's words word by word. To survive. Drag was struck by lightning. Really? His eyes were visibly red, and he grabbed his face with his big hands, choking and saying, I'm so sorry. I've caused trouble to the old man, everyone, and you. Tears flowed from deep between his fingers, and he bit his teeth hard. Damn, I wanted to be a hero like the old man. But now I'm a fugitive wanted by the whole world. Darren exhaled. Drag, what do you think a hero is? Darren was startled, raised his head and looked at Darren, and subconsciously said. A hero is someone who is strong enough to protect the weak and promote justice. Darren shook his head and said. No, strength is important, but a hero is actually a flag. Flag. Yes, the common people in this world are too weak, and the power they face is too strong. They may want to resist, but they lack a strong enough heart, so they need a flag. Darren smiled, his eyes burning. Give direction to the confused, inspire courage to the cowardly, and lay the foundation for the hesitant. Just like a huge torch illuminating the dark world, lighting the flames buried in people's hearts, and giving them the spiritual power to move forward. This is the true meaning of a hero. Perhaps in my opinion, you are more like a hero than Vice Admiral Garp now. Because you did something that none of us dared to do. He pointed at the stunned Drago and said meaningfully. You killed a celestial dragon in full view of the public. You broke the myth of this world, pulled the high God down from the altar. Hearing this, a smile appeared on Dorig's face, but before the smile was fully bloomed, he suddenly fell silent again, his expression gloomy. It's just that I failed to protect them after all. After the incident, he immediately fled the island. He heard such a news. The world government agents who arrived later launched a search on the island. The little boy flying the kite and his parents were tortured by the agents, and finally they couldn't survive. Regret is always the norm in the world. You can't protect everyone, but you have to keep moving forward, Dorag. Darren smiled. Hearing this, Dorag unconsciously straightened his chest, his tired smile was a bit desolate and proud. Boom. Another thunder that tore through the sky illuminated the world. In the howling wind, ink-like colors spread across the earth. Drip, drip. The raindrops kept falling, and soon it poured down. The wind and rain have arrived. At this time, Darren suddenly whispered without thinking. It should be about time. Darren didn't hear what he said, but was immersed in the heavy rain, feeling the cold rain hitting his hair and cheeks, he murmured. Is even the sky crying for this world? No, this is the sky seeing you off. Darren smiled and raised the wine glass in his hand. Drag was startled, and then smiled again. He picked up the wine glass. The two wine glasses carrying the most domineering wine collided heavily in midair, and the amber wine rippled with the luster of long journey and farewell. Drank it all in one gulp. Drag stood up suddenly, the confusion and loss in his eyes had disappeared, only the unyielding belief. Black hair fluttered wildly, and lightning illuminated his figure. From now on, former comrades are his enemies. The behemoth that ruled the world is his enemy. The corrupt old system is his enemy. The ignorant human heart is also his enemy. The world is raining heavily, and the road ahead is difficult and heavy. He can only walk alone. The whole world is an enemy. But he laughed heroically. Come on. Darren stood up slowly, raised his hand, and tore off the hooded coat that covered his face and concealed his identity. He revealed a black suit and a white cloak of justice. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, his cold voice seemed to cover the storm, the thunder and lightning, and spread across the entire island. Criminal Monkey D. Dragon, I, Rogers Darren, Commodore of the Navy Headquarters. In the name of justice, officially announce your arrest. Give up. I'll be grateful for everything. Chapter 162. He is almost dying, reinforcements. This sudden change made the chaotic crowd around suddenly pause. Before they could react, Darren and Dorag had already attacked almost at the same time. The military boots broke the water stains on the ground under their feet, and the two rushed towards each other like tigers pouncing on their prey. The fierce momentum broke the table and wine glass in front of them into pieces. The black dragon claws and the exploding fists broke through the heavy rain curtains, and collided heavily in the air with amazing power. Bang! The majestic air waves spread out in all directions with the attack points of the two as the center, raising horizontal rain curtains in the heavy rain, and the stone slabs on the street were constantly blown away like waves. The glass windows of the surrounding taverns, restaurants and shops were shattered at the same time in the explosion, and the civilians covered their ears in horror and ran around with their heads in their hands. Ha 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 ha. Your strength has improved a lot. Looking at the valiant Commodore in front of him, Drago's eyes burst with a strong fighting spirit, and he laughed happily. Darren smiled and said nothing. The figure quickly approached. Bang 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 bang. The two of them fought each other rapidly, and their fists, claws, knee strikes, and whip kicks wrapped in armed color domineering collided fiercely in the rain, making a dull explosion. Wherever they passed, whether it was street lights, dining tables, signs, or even obstacles such as buildings, they seemed to be swept by the tornado. As if swept by the wind, it turned into a ruin. Out of some tacit understanding, the trajectory of their fight moved towards the uninhabited area, and no civilians were harmed. Fighting has begun. The civilians who fled to the distance looked at the buildings that were affected by the fight between the two and collapsed one after another with horror on their faces. They couldn't help but gasp and couldn't believe their eyes. One of them reacted quickly and gritted his teeth and said, "Quick, keep calling the Den Den Mushi. Notify the Navy and ask them for reinforcements. If we rely on that Navy Commodore alone, I'm afraid we can't be his opponent. That's a criminal wanted by the world government." After the voice fell, the civilians dialed the Den Den Mushi again without hesitation. And this time, the communication was connected. It seems that the signal was unstable because of the storm. "Hey, we found that criminal dragon. Yes. A Navy is using his life to delay him. Send reinforcements here quickly." When he said this, the civilian holding the Den Den Mushi saw Darren, wearing a navy cloak, flying backwards like a cannonball, his body crashing through two buildings, and spitting blood from his mouth. His pupils suddenly contracted, his heart was chilled, and he hurriedly roared at the Den Den Mushi. "That Navy named Darren, he is about to lose. He is spitting blood. I feel he is about to die. Yes, this is the address. Damn it. Stop delaying. Send someone here quickly." At the same time, on the sea more than 100 miles away from the island where Dragon and Darren are located, two warships are struggling to move forward in the storm. Lightning and thunder. A Navy soldier in a raincoat rushed into the cabin in a panic, saluted with shaking hands. "Major General Sakaski. Major General Borsellino. Found it." Sakaski, who was flipping through the nautical chart by the light of the oil lamp, had a gloomy face and stood up suddenly. "Where is it?" Borsellino, who was standing by, adjusted his sunglasses and raised a teasing smile. "Here." The young Navy pointed to an island on the nautical chart, swallowed his saliva, and said with difficulty. "According to the witnesses on the island, Commodore Darren is fighting a fierce battle with the target, has been seriously injured, and is at a disadvantage. I'm afraid he can't hold on for too long." Sakaski's face suddenly became so gloomy that water was about to drip out. "Damn Dorag." The clenched fist gradually emitted a red light, and black smoke began to rise. "Borsellino." He turned around suddenly, staring at Borsellino coldly. The latter raised his hands and shrugged helplessly. "I know, I'll go there first." Sakaski said hoarsely. "We must hold back Drago, and never let him escape. ... I'll be there soon." Borsellino walked out of the cabin, muttering. "I can only say I'll do my best. After all, you know that guy is not so easy to deal with. He is Zepha's student and the son of Vice Admiral Garp. After saying this, his figure suddenly spread into countless golden photons, then whistled into the sky and instantly disappeared in the storm. Of course I know. A haze flashed in Sakaski's eyes, and he murmured in a low voice as he looked at the light disappearing in the distance. He and Dragon had always been at odds with each other, and conflicts often broke out. There were also many cases where they fought because of different ideas of executing justice. Naturally, he knew how strong Dragon was. And Sakaski was also very clear about the other meaning implied in Borsellino's words. Do you really want to deal with Dragon? Putting aside his strength, he is still a student of teacher Zepha, and the biological son of Vice Admiral Garp. Sakaski was silent for a few seconds, picked up the peaked military cap on the table expressionlessly, lowered his head and put it on. The shadow of the brim of the hat covered his eyes. His fists clenched tighter and tighter. Let's go. Boom. Darren walked out of the ruins of the building and spat blood foam on the ground. It's really exciting. He squinted at Dragon, who was full of fighting spirit in the distance, and raised his hand to wipe the blood from his mouth. It's you who gets carried away easily when fighting. The corner of his mouth twitched. Ha 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 ha. Darren, how is it? That strike just now was the ultimate move of the Dragon Claw Fist. Drag laughed excitedly, his face full of pride. Through the technique of the Dragon Claw, the power bursts out in an instant, just like the breath of a giant dragon. How is it? Let's try this move next. I've long wanted to have a hearty fight with you. After the voice fell, Drag raised his arm, and the palm of his hand began to gather a dark green hurricane frantically. The air was like a sharp blade that cut everything, spinning at a terrifying speed in his palm. It rose up, continued to expand, and finally formed a huge wind column as high as 20 to 30 meters. Its exaggerated distortion and destructive power, the surrounding buildings and houses were uprooted and rolled into the eye of the wind just a little closer, and then twisted into waste. Looking at this horrible scene, Darren's eyes trembled wildly. Please everything, thank you very much. Chapter 163 You Don't Know Swordsmanship. Hey, are you serious? This idiot. Seeing the giant hurricane in Dorig's hand that was still expanding, Darren's eyes twitched constantly, and he couldn't help cursing in his heart. Ha 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 ha, come on. At this time, the huge wind column had been compressed to the extreme. Dorag laughed up to the sky, took a step forward, and threw the astonishing green hurricane towards Darren's position with one hand. Hurricane roaring. A vast storm suddenly emerged. The storm that escaped from Dorig's palm seemed to have lost its containment and expanded wildly at an extremely alarming speed. The speed of the eye of the storm was getting more and more violent. The buildings several meters high on both sides of the street were swallowed up directly as long as they were slightly touched, and were crushed into powder in the strong wind. The surging hurricane destroyed all obstacles in its path. The earth was lifted up and swallowed like a wave. Road signs, streetlights and bricks were rolled up into the sky in the strong wind, splashing large rain curtains. The storm, like a natural disaster, came in front of him. Crackling. Darren suddenly felt a terrifying sense of oppression. The hurricane was still tens of meters away, but he had begun to have a tendency to stand unsteadily, as if he would be washed away at any time. The ground under his feet cracked one after another, and cracks were everywhere. What a madman. Looking at this exaggerated destructive power, Darren couldn't help but laugh and curse. But his eyes also burst out with a fiery fighting spirit, like a rising flame. A hint of unruly arc gradually appeared at the corner of his mouth. How strong is Dragon at this moment? The strength of a Navy admiral. Darren didn't know. But at least one thing is certain, if this guy has not reached the admiral level of combat power, then he is definitely the closest person to the admiral level combat power in this sea. Learning from two Navy legends, Zephyr and Garp, he is talented enough to create a powerful physical skill like Dragon Claw Fist, plus the top natural Devil Fruit. At least according to the information obtained by Darren from the cooperation with Dragon and Sakaski, Dragon's strength is definitely comparable to Sakaski, and even to some extent, it is slightly better. How strong is Darren now? Darren is also unclear. Maybe. Looking up at the oncoming, destructive storm, Darren smiled coldly, his eyes gleaming with dazzling light under his black hair that was blown by the wind. Now is the time to figure it out. He suddenly raised his hand horizontally. A sharp black light suddenly whistled from afar and stopped steadily in front of him. The black hilt, the sharp blade with ghost-like patterns. Yan Mo. The moment Yan Mo descended, the surrounding air seemed to be frozen by the ghost and demonic energy it released, becoming oppressive and cold. Then, it's up to you. A crazy scarlet flashed in Darren's eyes, and he grasped Yan Mo's hilt with one hand. The rain was heavy. The storm was coming, almost covering the sky. In an instant. It was clearly visible to the naked eye. One after another, purple-black streams of light emerged silently from the storm, like strange fireflies, constantly pouring out of Darren's body. It was as if the purple-black light bands provoked the gusts of cold wind. It was as if endless armed color-domineering auras were intertwined and flying, and finally entangled on the Yama blade that Darren was holding in his hand. Ah! Darren let out a low roar like a beast, his eyes gradually filled with hideous bloodshot, and on his muscular arms, the blue veins twisted and squirmed like centipedes. At this moment, he held the knife in one hand, like a warrior standing proudly against the storm. Yan Mo was like a hungry beast, madly devouring his domineering aura, and then releasing the gloomy ghost aura, forming a cyclone visible to the naked eye. The storms were completely isolated from the outside. Like a surging and burning ghost fire. This is a demon's sword. Derek, who was far away, saw this scene and his eyes suddenly widened. What are you doing, Darren? You can't use a sword. He was full of disbelief and his mouth opened. The amount of domineering energy absorbed by the demon's sword at this moment made even him feel frightened. But what confused him the most was that Darren, who was obviously not good at swordsmanship, took out a demon's sword for no reason and fed it with his domineering energy crazily. What was he doing? Is he swinging it like a firewood stick? Who said you can't use a sword if you don't know swordsmanship? Darren, who had been lowering his head slightly as if enduring severe pain, raised his head, his eyes lingering with wild beast-like madness. He suddenly let go of the hand holding Yan Mo. He raised his head unruly, and the wide cloak behind him fluttered wildly. Shoot it, Yan Mo. After the words fell, Dorag seemed to sense something, and his pupils suddenly shrank. Boom. The surging and boundless magnetic field instantly boiled, pushing the black demon's sword forward violently. The bursting airflow generated orange-red electric magnetic shock wave. Yan Mo's speed instantly jumped to the extreme. In Dorag's violently trembling pupils. The roaring Yan Mo, wrapped in purple-black air waves, directly plunged into the center of the hurricane with a scale of tens of meters. Breaking the surface with a point. The stalemate lasted only for a moment, and the vast hurricane storm suddenly exploded, and the air waves exploded and shattered the glass and walls of all buildings within a radius of a kilometer. Eye of the wind. The impact of Yan Mo's attack directly destroyed the eye of the hurricane, just like a surgical knife with extreme precision, directly destroying the storm from its strongest and weakest point. Then, with a swish, Yan Mo turned into a sharp and strange black light, and instantly crossed a distance of hundreds of meters. The speed was so fast that it almost disappeared into the void. Drag's eyelids twitched wildly, and his observation hockey's perception instantly rose to the extreme. His hand turned into a dragon claw and stretched out. Dragon claw. Dang. A sharp explosion like a meteorite crash suddenly exploded, and a majestic air wave spread wildly in all directions. Looking at the Yama in front of him, who was tightly grasped by his three-finger dragon claws and constantly colliding with a large number of sparks, Drag's forehead dripped a drop of cold sweat. At this time, his pupils suddenly contracted, as if he saw something incredible. A barely perceptible thin line gradually emerged and derived in the center of dozens of buildings around him. If someone were to observe from the sky above at this time, they would see a shocking scene. From Darren's position, a huge fan-shaped range radiates forward. All buildings within a range of more than 1 kilometer are like tofu blocks. As if they were cut by invisible silk threads. Cut from the center. Separated into two parts. The cut surface is smooth as a mirror. I'm grateful for everything. Chapter 164 Don't Look Back. Boom. The upper half of dozens of buildings slowly slid down along the smooth cut, and then collapsed continuously, causing bursts of rumbling, smoke rising, and dust flying. Drag's eyelids twitched again. Just the air wave generated by the blade passing through the air at high speed cut the buildings within the range. The power of Darren's knife gave him the feeling that it was infinitely close to the level of a great swordsman. It's just that unlike the round, natural, and hearty slashes of a real great swordsman, Darren's move pursues pure speed. First, he used the armed color domineering to infuse the blade to enhance its toughness and cutting power, and then in an instant, he raised the propulsion force of the demon sword to the extreme. It's so cruel. Drag felt that the 5 fingers that were holding Yanmo had begun to ooze blood, and felt a burning pain, and couldn't help cursing. Who is a good person who uses a knife like this? This crude method. What's the difference between throwing a cannonball with bare hands? It's my turn. But just as Drag was stunned, a low voice suddenly sounded behind him. He suddenly widened his eyes and turned around subconsciously. You sneak attack. Bang. A fist wrapped in a solemn and dark domineering aura quickly enlarged in the reflection of his pupils, and then heavily sank into his face. The power of this punch was so great that even Drag's cheek muscles trembled like ripples. Boom. The next moment, Dorig's body seemed to be hit by a warship traveling at the highest speed. It flew backwards for dozens of meters like a cannonball, smashing through several buildings that were only half remaining. The snow-white cloak fluttered, and Darren's body landed steadily. At the moment when his knees sank slightly, the ground under his feet seemed to be hit by an anti-aircraft gun, and a shocking huge pit was blown up. With the help of the reaction force of this force, Darren flew out again. Don't let this bastard Dorag catch his breath. He crashed into the ruins of the collapsed building like a mad beast. 1 second later, 2 figures who were fighting and confronting each other shot out from the ruins at the same time. Boom. 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 Under the fearful and shocked eyes of the trembling people in the distance, Darren and Dorag seemed to be angry. The repeated bombings caused by the high-frequency collision almost made them tinnitus. Darren, you bastard, you slapped me in the face. Darren's figure suddenly dispersed into a whirlwind, and reunited into a human form 10 meters away, and waved his hand angrily. Several huge dark green wind blades suddenly condensed and slashed out, shooting towards Darren. His face was visibly swollen, his nose was purple and blue, and 2 lines of nosebleed gushed out. Darren smashed a wind blade with a punch, and his chest was cut into a cross-shaped blood mark by the other 2. He raised his foot and kicked out a storm kick. Swish. The light green storm kick slashed and tore the earth, but instantly, penetrated, Dorig's body, sank into a building in the distance, and cut the building in half vertically from the center. Tisk, the natural system is troublesome. Darren he spat out a mouthful of blood foam impatiently, and his peripheral vision quickly swept across the sea surface of the port that was getting closer and closer. He seemed to have finally found something, and a ray of light flashed in the depths of his pupils. Finally arrived. Thinking of this, Darren suddenly laughed up to the sky. Come on, Dorag, let's fight it out next. Dragoo was stunned when he heard the words, and then his eyes burst into a more blazing light. Come on. But before he finished speaking, the surrounding environment suddenly changed strangely. Countless steel bars and metals suddenly shot out from the ground and the nearby building ruins, quickly entangled like countless black giant pythons, strangling Dorag. It's useless. I'm a natural system. Dragoo laughed disapprovingly, and his figure turned into a hurricane again. The attacks and strangulations of the metal giant pythons all failed, raising rolling dust on the ground. The next moment, a crazy figure broke through the thick dust like a tiger, and in the blink of an eye, it approached Dragon at an amazing speed. Another sneak attack. Dragon was stunned for a moment, then laughed. I won't let you succeed this time. 5 fingers instantly bent to form sharp dragon claws, and the black armed color domineering instantly covered them, and it was about to catch Darren's fist. But at this moment, the Commodore suddenly grinned at him, and then approached him without any warning. Dragon's pupils suddenly shrank into fine needles. He wanted to stop. But it was too late. Swish. The dragon's claws, which were enough to destroy steel and mountains, instantly tore open the Commodore's chest, leaving a terrifying claw mark deep enough to see the bone. Hot blood spurted out in large pieces, splashing on Dragon's face. Dragon was struck by lightning. His face was full of disbelief. Why didn't he block or dodge? Don't look back, my friend. A deep voice sounded in his ears. Before Drago could react, he felt that his hand was firmly grasped by Darren. The Commodore was expressionless and endured the injury. His body flexibly rotated in the air. He fired a powerful shot at Drago's belly. Bang! Drago spat out a mouthful of blood. His whole body was bent like a cooked shrimp, and his eyeballs seemed to be bulging out. Boom! A dull explosion sounded again. The second burst of armed color domineering, as well as the terrifying power of Darren's kick, directly kicked Drago out. Its speed was so fast that it even exploded circles of white air waves on the flight trajectory along the way. After smashing through several buildings in succession, Drago, who was grinning in pain, suddenly felt that the scene in front of him was suddenly clear. This is the sky. No, it's the sea. Damn Darren, is he really going to kill me? But at this moment, Dorag suddenly discovered an extremely strange fact. A small merchant ship with an extremely ordinary appearance was speeding towards the sea in his direction at an incredible speed. And with his falling speed and direction, his eyes suddenly lit up. The next moment, bang! Drago's figure fell heavily on the deck of the small merchant ship, smashing a hole in the deck. Guest, sit tight. The owner of the ship turned his back to him, skillfully controlled the rudder, and said in a low voice, "We are about to set sail." Drago climbed out of the hole, rubbing his head with a grin, and subconsciously looked towards the direction of the port land. The seriously injured Commodore knelt on one knee like a bloody man, looking at his direction calmly. As if saying goodbye to himself. Darren. Darren couldn't help but murmured, his eyes slightly red. He resisted the urge to wave in the direction of the port, and just when he was about to nod and say, "Yeah," a dazzling golden light suddenly lit up on the dark sky in the distance. "I can't let you escape like this. I'm grateful for everything." Chapter 165 I Am the Storm. At the moment when the dazzling golden light rose in the distant sky, both Dorag and Darren's pupils shrank slightly. This damn sound. Borsellino. Darren panted and gritted his teeth. He didn't expect that this bastard who always liked to be late would come so quickly. He had tried his best to plan. At the beginning, he used the ability of the magnet fruit to block the Den Den Mushi signal of this small island to prevent civilians from notifying the Navy and local government through Den Den Mushi. In addition to buying time for himself and Dragon to say goodbye for the last time. The most important point is to wait for the ship disguised as a merchant ship to arrive. That's why his eyes kept glancing at the sea between talking and fighting. Although Dragon's ability is a natural hurricane, which can float for a short time, it is impossible to fly long distances in the boundless ocean. This is similar to the natural characteristics of Smoker and Crocodile. It can only transform into an element within a certain range and float and move, but it can't cross the sea for a long distance like those Devil Fruit ability users who really have the ability of flying. In fact, all natural Devil Fruit ability users are like this. This point Darren got evidence from the flying squirrel. Even if someone has the ability of the Thunder Fruit, which can transform elements into lightning and move at the speed of light in space, he cannot fly long distances across the sea. It can only be relatively limited to the scope of a country or an island. This may be related to the consumption of physical strength, and even Darren is not sure about the specific reason. But in fact, it can be understood. If Enel can really transform into lightning and travel long distances through space at will, he doesn't need to build an ark, and can directly travel through the void to the infinite land. And this can also be inferred that Borsellino is in a similar state. With the ability to transform elements into light, he can move at the speed of light, but he can never achieve long-distance flights like crossing the sea. After all, in the original plot, every time this guy travels, no matter how urgent the mission and situation are, he must take a warship. This is the best evidence. After all, the devil fruit that truly has the ability to fly long distances is rarer than the natural devil fruit in this sea. Therefore, if you want to let Dorag escape successfully, you can't just rely on his own ability, but you must find him a ship. But now. Damn it. Darren couldn't help cursing in his heart and clenched his fists. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind, but Darren could only watch Borsellino's figure reconstructed by countless golden photons in the distant sky. In this case, he can no longer make a move. Without understanding Borsellino's true position, he dare not guarantee whether this guy will stab him in the back. The most important thing is that since Borsellino has arrived, it also means that Sakaski is expected to arrive soon. While his thoughts were flying, the bright golden light suddenly became stronger, like a golden sun, briefly illuminating the dark sky. Borsellino! Darren roared with blood on his mouth, and his messy black hair danced wildly in the rainstorm. Dragoo, you did something irreversible. I'm sorry I have to kill you. Dragoo's figure was reflected in Borsellino's sunglasses, and a teasing arc appeared at the corner of his mouth. His arms were spread out horizontally, and his fingers were pinched into the shape of orchid fingers. The golden light was dazzling to the extreme in an instant. Here it comes. Dragoo's eyes condensed, and a curve appeared at the corner of his mouth. As a former colleague, he knew better than anyone how powerful this yellow monkey was. An unprecedented sense of oppression and threat of death surged into his heart, but Doragoo's eyes were brighter than any moment in his past life. My story has just begun. I have to make it a comedy. He took a step forward and laughed loudly. A new era is waiting for me. What reason can stop a man from running to the sea of freedom? Drag roared with red eyes, and the hideous blue veins stood out on his scarred cheeks. Borsellino's figure was now submerged by endless golden light, and only the mocking smile at the corner of his mouth was still clear. You can't resist the coming storm. The next second. The golden light bullets in the sky shot through the heavy rain curtain like a torrential rain, covering the small boat like an overwhelming force. Yashikani no Magatama. No. Drag was bathed in the wind and rain, laughing heartily. I am the storm. His hands were opened and raised high, and the dark green cloak behind him suddenly fluttered. Wind. Strong wind. A huge storm like a tornado suddenly rose on the surface of the turbulent sea, rolling up vast waves. The huge waves were roaring, and the sky was roaring. The storm raised layers of tsunamis, almost covering the sky and the sun to meet the light bombs pouring down from the sky. Boom! The fiery red explosions exploded one after another in the tsunami like a continuous mountain range, blasting out exaggerated holes in the sea water, which were then filled with more and more vast sea water. The scorching high temperature of the light bomb evaporated a huge amount of sea water, making the entire sea surface linger with thick white steam. This is not over yet. Along with the roar of Dorag, the endless wind pushed the tsunami higher and higher, and it pounced on Borsellino in the air with its fangs and claws. Oh! Borsellino narrowed his eyes under his sunglasses. There's really nothing we can do about it. His figure suddenly dispersed into countless photons, avoiding the impact of the surging tsunami. His slow voice kept echoing in the sky, but are you sure you can withstand the next attack from that guy? As soon as the words fell, Darren and Dorag's breathing stagnated at the same time. Boom! A powerful warship suddenly broke through the thick steam in the rushing sea water, like a shark ship breaking the ice, and suddenly jumped up on the waves. The high-spirited bow was raised high, and one could even clearly see the large area of sea water dragged out by the bottom of the ship, as well as the huge anchor flashing with cold light. You can't run away, Dorag. The bow on the top, a tall figure with a deep breath stood there like a reef thousands of feet high, with a wide cloak fluttering behind him. The delicate and beautiful blood-red rose on the chest of the black suit, under the thunderous and lightning storm sky, exuded a suffocating murderous intent and blood. Major Admiral of the Navy Headquarters, Sakaski. I ask for everything, thank you very much. Chapter 166 Sailing Towards the Dawn. The warship overwhelmed the waves with its momentum. Sakaski stood at the bow of the warship, his figure motionless in the storm, just standing there gave people an indescribable sense of oppression. He stared at the ship drifting in the waves in the distance, his eyes under the military cap were gloomy and cold, and his entire right arm began to emit a scarlet light. The really tricky guy is here. Drag's face turned slightly pale under the beating of the cold rain, and his lips were tightly pursed. If Borsellino, a guy who is hard to see through, might still consider the friendship of his colleagues, then Sakaski, who pursues absolute justice, will never hold back. Boom. A shell suddenly fell from the sky, but was blocked by a layer of swirling wind and then sank into the sea. The explosion bloomed in the sea water, raising a water column, causing the ship to shake more violently, and it was difficult to move forward in the waves and the shock waves of the shells. A touch of orange-red flames bloomed on the warships in the distance, and shells whistled in one after another. On the shaking deck, Dorag held the mast tightly. "Guest, if you continue like this, the ship will sink soon." The slightly trembling voice of the owner at the helm came. "I know." Dora gritted his teeth and growled. His eyes were fixed on Sakaski on the warship, and he made a quick decision in his heart. "Don't look back." A dark green hurricane that was clearly visible to the naked eye quickly gathered in his palm. "Then let me see your determination, Sakaski." Drag's eyes were instantly filled with bloodshot, and he threw the wind ball in his hand heavily. "The sea is my battlefield." The moment the wind ball was launched, it swelled and expanded wildly out of control, but in the blink of an eye it turned into a huge waterspout that connected the sky and the earth. Especially in this stormy weather, the waterspout was greatly amplified, carrying the momentum of destroying everything, and, pushed, towards the warship where Sakaski was like a heavy wall. Destroy the world. What is that? What a huge tornado storm. Damn it. With such a scale and speed, it is impossible for a warship to avoid it. The faces of the Navy on the warship turned pale in an instant, and they looked at the sea tornado that almost covered the sky and the earth with horror. Their hearts were horrified and their bodies trembled uncontrollably. Seeing this exaggerated scene, Darren on the port also had his pupils shrink and his mind was shocked. In this climate and environment, the power that Dragon's wind fruit can exert is at least twice that of the normal state. It can be said without hesitation that this turbulent sea is indeed his home ground. The power of the natural disaster level. When Marshal Kong gave this devil fruit to Dragon, he could hope that he could use it to fight against the abilities of Whitebeard and Golden Lion. A slow voice suddenly sounded behind Darren. Darren glanced at Borsellino who walked beside him, narrowed his eyes and said, "Aren't you going to help?" Borsellino scratched his head pretending to be helpless. "I tried my best, but I still couldn't do anything to him. The next step can only be handed over to Sakaski. After all, the entire Navy headquarters knows that among the new generation of the Navy, only he can be compared with a genius like Drago. Besides," he pointed at Darren's terrible injury, and sighed. "I still have to take care of the injured, don't I? If your injury is not treated in time, it may be life-threatening." Darren's eyes flashed. He and Borsellino looked at each other, and they both laughed at the same time. "Indeed, we have tried our best." Darren nodded, deeply in agreement, and then spat out a mouthful of blood with a pale face. "Thank you, Major General Borsellino." The two stood and sat, staying in place in tacit understanding. While they were talking, the magnificent sea tornado storm had already descended in front of the warship, like the huge mouth of a ferocious beast, about to swallow the entire warship in one gulp. The storm is coming. The whole world suddenly stagnated. Through the twisted tornado and waves, Darren vaguely saw a red figure suddenly jumping up from the bow of the warship. Then, it was as if a flame exploded in the sea water. It was as if magma erupted in an iceberg. A ball of scarlet light, in the center of the dark green waterspout, enlarged wildly. The next moment. Boom! A column of surging magma fire shot through the waterspout, blasting a huge hole in the roaring sea water. Die, Dorag! Sakaski was like a vicious dog staring at its prey, stepping on the air, his figure smashed through the sea water and rain, and rushed towards the ship. The future of the world waiting for me. Drag leapt up with his eyes burning, and his arms turned into a violent hurricane. The two jumped into the air at the same time, and their eyes were filled with boundless fighting spirit. The dark green shabby coat and the snow-white navy cloak danced wildly in the opposite direction. Dark clouds gathered above their heads, lightning and thunder danced in between, brewing a vast storm. The dark red magma surged and expanded, turning into a huge magma dog. The violent hurricane twisted and roared, gathering into the shape of a green dragon. One punch. One claw. Dog bites red lotus. Hurricane dragon's breath. Boom. Fists and claws collide. The attacks of the two collided like a meteorite hitting the earth. The roaring wind dragon and the hellhound bit each other's necks at the same time. The mighty air waves spread out in all directions with the two as the center. The devil fruits and domineering of the two formed two different cyclones of dark green and red, respectively, which squeezed and devoured each other. Molten magma slid down Sakaski's chin, and he roared with his eyes cracking. "You have betrayed the Navy." Boom. The magma fist pushed forward and exploded again, and it had a tendency to suppress the hurricane dragon claw. Draeger's mouth was bleeding as if he had been hit hard. In a trance, countless pictures flashed through his mind. The little boy flying a kite. The hateful faces of the celestial dragons. The parents raised their guns with trembling hands. The face that hurt slightly. All the faces and experiences flashed before his eyes like a revolving lantern at this moment, and finally gathered into a long and ancient word. The people. In an instant, an indescribable feeling rose from Dragon's chest, as if the anger and unwillingness that had been suppressed for a long time finally came out at this moment. Boom. The majestic and deep momentum burst out, and the whole island seemed to shake at this moment. Tear, tear, tear. Black and red lightnings emerged in the void. Hegemony color. Amid Sakaski's surprised exclamation, Dorag roared with a smile. "But I have never betrayed justice." The three-fingered dragon claw gushed out amazing power, like the breath of a giant dragon. Sakaski's pupils shrank, and his eyes were instantly filled with bloodshot. Bang! The magma giant dog suddenly exploded, and his figure was thrown out heavily, smashing into the deck of the warship amid the exclamations of the Navy. Dorag also flew back to the small boat, with a trace of blood oozing from the corner of his mouth. His face was extremely pale, but his eyes were extremely bright. Ha 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 ha. Set sail, set sail. He did not look back. With a swish, the merchant ship's sails suddenly spread out, and driven by the strong wind, it soared like a young eagle, flying through the storm. Drag laughed, smashed the cargo box on the deck with one hand, took out a bottle of liquor from it, and drank it headfirst. The spicy liquor cut his throat, making his eyes bloodshot, and his domineering aura burst out wildly, shocking the Navy on the distant warships dizzy and kneeling on one knee. The night sky flashed with lightning, and Dorag saw his scarred face in the reflection of the bottle. He grinned. The three-fingered dragon claw did not hesitate. He scratched his left cheek, covering the scar, forming a crisscross blood mark. As if reborn. He bathed in the storm, opened his hands wantonly, and let the rain wash away the wounds and blood on his body. The road ahead was heavy and difficult, and he had no one to tell. In this case, let's tell the world. He suddenly recalled an epic poem he had read in an ancient book, so he sang loudly and heroically. For the will of the people. For the progress of society. Let the strong liquor of resistance fill your heart. See you tomorrow, my friend. We must create light, even though the night is long. Light up this land and change lives. Dorager's singing became louder and more distant, his hands dancing like a conductor. This rainstorm. This strong wind. Echoing his cheers and roars. The sea is surging. Pushing the boat on its journey. Celebrating his rebirth and transformation. The song of freedom resounds through the sea and the world at this moment. I am willing to dedicate everything I have. If you need to be generous for it, I want to be the first one, the name engraved on the monument of hope. Note 1. He stood on a tattered boat, singing, laughing, shedding tears, bleeding, walking through the wind and rain, heading for the dawn in the distance. Note 1. From To the People, released in 1985, it is an episode in the world-famous musical, Les Miserables, adapted from the novel of the same name. B Station has this song video, People's Song. Ask for everything, thank you very much. Chapter 167 Wiping ass in the storm, the rebellious and generous singing gradually faded away. The afterglow of the voice lingered in everyone's heart for a long time. It was as if this ancient epic text there is a mysterious and great power hidden in it, which makes people's blood boil and their mood surge. The navy on the warship knelt on one knee, staring blankly at the dilapidated boat that disappeared in the distance, and they didn't know when they were already in tears. They didn't understand the content of the lyrics, but the heroic and tragic melody was full of power. At the port of the island, a dense crowd of people had gathered at some point. They also stood there with excitement and were silent for a long time. It's getting troublesome now. He actually awakened the conqueror's hockey. Borsalino put his hands in his pockets and said with a smile. Darren smiled meaningfully. It seems that his guess may be correct. For a navy, killing a celestial dragon is the fastest and most convenient way to awaken the conqueror's hockey. No, maybe it's not just that. Darren suddenly shook his head and overturned this speculation. Dragon's conqueror's hockey was not awakened at the moment of killing the celestial dragon, but it erupted naturally at the moment when his mentality changed and his faith was firm. It can be seen that killing the celestial dragon is only one of the factors. The so-called conqueror's hockey refers to the power of spirit. This is a kind of power from the heart. The deepest reason for a person to awaken conqueror's hockey is often the change of heart brought about by external stimulation. For example, when seeing relatives in danger of life, the obsession of saving relatives awakens conqueror's hockey. Another example is the ambition to gallop across the sea when being oppressed. Another example is the dream of pursuing freedom and the unruly will. It seems that the behavior of killing a celestial dragon itself is not enough to awaken a navy's hockey. At least it is not the whole reason. Whether the will of the navy is strong enough, whether the mental pressure he faces is huge enough, and whether he can finally find his own belief in the pressure and confusion brought by killing the celestial dragons and practice it for his whole life. This is the key to awakening the conqueror's hockey. However, he is worthy of being the future leader of the revolutionary army and the most vicious criminal in the eyes of the government. Draeger's newly awakened conqueror's hockey has reached the level of being able to evolve black and red lightning. The mental impact that came to his face made Darren, who also awakened the conqueror's hockey, feel dazed and numb for a moment. It was precisely with the addition of conqueror's hockey that Dragon was able to suppress Sakaski in the last blow, thus gaining the opportunity to escape. Just as Darren's thoughts were flying, Sakaski's ship and another late warship had slowly entered the port. Sakaski walked down from the warship deck with a gloomy face, and there was a shocking trace of blood on the corner of his mouth. Darren noticed that his right hand was dripping with blood. Borsalino, why don't you chase him? Sakaski stared at Borsalino expressionlessly, with a tone of interrogation. Borsalino raised his hands in surrender and said innocently. Monster, that has awakened the domineering color domineering, plus Dragon's ability is extremely advantageous on the sea. Even if I chase him, there will be no good results. And Commodore Darren also needs someone to take care of him, doesn't he? He suddenly lowered his voice and smiled meaningfully. Sakaski, it's better not to do some things too much. You also heard that Dragon did not betray the righteousness. Sakaski was silent for a while after hearing this. He glanced at Darren, and seeing the terrible injuries on the latter, he took out the military Den Den Mushi with an indifferent look and dialed the signal of the headquarters. Soon the Den Den Mushi communication was connected. What's the situation, Sakaski? General Sengoku's anxious voice came from the Den Den Mushi. Sakaski pursed his lips and said hoarsely. Report to General Sengoku. During the fierce battle, the target criminal Monkey D. Dragon awakened the conqueror's hockey. Brigadier General Darren and I were seriously injured, Major General Borsalino. He glanced at the corner of Borsalino's clothes wet by the sea water, and his eyes twitched slightly. Minor injuries. The target escaped by chance, and the arrest mission failed. There was obvious silence on the Den Den Mushi side for a long time. I understand. Thank you for your hard work, Sakaski. Sengoku's voice seemed to be relieved, and his tone became steady again. Rest here and return immediately. He seemed to remember something and asked again, By the way, is Darren conscious? Sakaski was stunned and looked at Darren, who nodded. Yes, he is conscious. That's good, give him the military Den Mushi, I have something to say to him. Sakaski frowned, but in the end he didn't say anything, handed the Den Mushi to Darren, and then he and Borsellino headed towards the sea, walked a few steps away. Ahem. General Sengoku, it's me. Darren coughed weakly a few times, panting slightly to the Den Mushi. How is your physical condition? Sengoku couldn't help asking when he heard the cough. Darren smiled and said, General Sengoku, don't worry. Well, that's good. Sengoku pondered for a moment, and suddenly lowered his voice. The finishing work of this matter is handed over to you, what are you going to do? Darren looked like he had expected it, and his expression was a little helpless. In the end, I still have to clean up the mess. Drag, this bastard, kill the celestial dragons if you want, why do you have to kill them in my territory? He sorted out his thoughts and said slowly. General Sengoku, all newspapers and publications in the North Sea will publish a news item tomorrow. The main content of the news is that the criminal gang led by the vicious criminal Monkey D. Dragon was completely defeated by the Navy. Dragon himself is unknown whether he is alive or dead, and all 500 of his subordinates have been arrested. But there is no criminal group under Dragon's command. Sengoku blurted out. But the moment he said it, he immediately understood. This is to give an explanation to the world government to vent his anger. Otherwise, you can't just bite the bullet and say that after mobilizing so many combat forces, Dragon escaped, which makes the Navy seem too incompetent. It's too fake. I will handle it. It just so happens that the North Sea has been too quiet for a long time. Darren smiled. Please thank you for everything. Chapter 168 Reward, Monkey D. Dragon. Well, I am very confident that you can do things. The sound of Sengoku's satisfied laughter came from the Den Mushi. The next sentence of Darren made Sengoku stop laughing immediately. Darren smiled and said, But General Sengoku, you see such a big thing happened in the North Sea this time. In less than a day, the North Sea Navy wiped out a criminal gang of no less than 500 people. Does the headquarters have any comments? What do you mean by any comments? Sengoku asked in confusion. Well, you know, the consumption of military weapons, the treatment costs and pensions for the casualties, and the appeasement of the public's emotions. This is not a small amount of money when added up. Warring states. He was silent for a second, and then his gritted teeth came from the Den Mushi. 300 million Baileys. This is the maximum amount of funds that the headquarters can allocate. Darren boy. 300 million Baileys. It is a technical job to wipe the ass, and it is also a hard job. Although Darren has now obtained the huge gold treasure of Sky Island, he lacks everything except money, but the principle he has always adhered to is, I will do things if I get money. This sentence can be understood from another perspective, that is, if you want me to do something, you have to pay first. As for the difficulty of the things to be done. Sorry, you have to pay more. Although 300 million Baileys are not much, it is indeed a lot in this timeline. After all, the value of Baileys has not yet started to inflate. Besides, after the terrible incident with Drago, the headquarters will probably have to tighten their belts in the future, so he can't be too harsh. That's fine, it's better than nothing. Thinking of this, Darren smiled with satisfaction and said. Then on behalf of the soldiers of the North Sea, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Admiral Sengoku and the headquarters for their assistance and support. Sengoku rolled his eyes and his mood suddenly became bad. That's it, you also follow Sakaski and the others back to the headquarters, don't run around. Zephyr is already impatient, and I can't persuade him. Darren nodded. Yes, Admiral Sengoku. Blue. The communication with the Den Mushi was immediately interrupted. Admiral Sengoku's instructions are. At this time, Sakaski and Borsellino came over, and the former took the military Den Mushi returned by Darren. Nothing, just told me to finish some finishing work. Darren stood up on his knees and replied casually. After all, this happened in the North Sea. To some extent, it is more convenient for me to clean up the mess. Well, I will continue to hunt down Dorag. Sakaski nodded. How is your injury? Do you need to stay here for a day? Darren smiled and said. It's okay, we can set sail at any time. He could feel that the wound under the blood-stained military uniform had stopped bleeding. Sakaski stopped talking, turned around with a cold look, and boarded the warship with a group of Navy soldiers. The storm had stopped at this time. At some point, the sun in the distance had quietly risen. The warm sunshine was scattered on the calm sea, and the sky was clear and blue. The dawn light spread across the earth. Darren stood there, subconsciously looking at the direction where Dragon was going away on the sea in the distance, and a faint smile gradually appeared on the corner of his mouth. Don't look back, my friend. He murmured softly. At the same time. Navy Headquarters, Admiral's Office. Zongguo slowly put down the military Den Mushi in his hand, sat back in his office chair without saying a word, and breathed a sigh of relief. No matter what, this is the best result. The Crane staff officer sitting on the sofa next to him whispered. Yes. Zongguo nodded. This is the best result. From a rational and emotional point of view, they didn't want to see that brat dragon fall into the hands of the celestial dragons. From the perspective of justice, they more or less didn't think that Dragon's action was wrong. Protecting the weak has always been the duty of the Navy. A young man with an unprecedented sense of justice couldn't stand this cruel world, and he angrily attacked and blood splattered on the spot. It's not his fault. Perhaps, if Dragon's character was not like this, they would not have such high expectations for the former. From a personal perspective, they were even more reluctant to see Dragon die at the hands of their own people, or at the hands of the celestial dragons. Even if he was not Garp's son, Dragon was also what they watched grow up, and they naturally developed a deep relationship over the years. So, what are you going to do next, Sengoku? Staff Officer Crane looked at Zongguo with some concern and asked. Zongguo pinched his temples, thought for a moment, and said slowly. Erase all traces of Dragon's existence in the Navy, and seal all files and materials to avoid other uncontrollable effects. Issue a gag order to everyone, and it is strictly forbidden to talk about any news or intelligence about Dragon. Staff Officer Crane nodded in agreement. Dragon's defection to the Navy is a foregone conclusion. Although they feel deeply sorry for this young man who should have a bright future, as the management of the Navy, the first thing they should do is to control the situation. You know, Dragon himself has a special identity and strong strength, coupled with his unique personality, charm and leadership ability. He has a large number of followers in the Navy. Zongguo must take action as soon as possible to prevent these followers from defecting with Dragon. Otherwise, the entire Navy system may usher in a terrible earthquake. What about Garp? Staff Officer, he asked with a serious face. Zongguo shook his head. He shouldn't be implicated too much. That bastard's reputation and strength are there. Even if the government officials and the celestial dragons want to touch him, they have to weigh the possible adverse effects. Besides, what can the 5 elders do to Garp? The government still needs him to hunt down Roger. So what can be done? Demotion, suspension of salary, or dismissal? He smiled helplessly. Garp doesn't care about these things. As for encirclement and suppression, or even wanted, that's even more impossible. You know, Garp is not Zephyr. If that bastard suffers any grievances, he can't hold it in. When he said the last sentence, Zongguo's voice became low. Staff Officer, he seemed to remember something, and his eyes darkened. Zongguo sighed and said slowly. Send out a bounty order. The bounty target is Monkey D. Dragon. The bounty is. He paused. 2 billion Baileys. Ask for everything, thank you very much. Chapter 169. A game. 500 pirates are criminals, right? Well, I know, before midnight tonight. No problem. North Sea, Lubeck Island, Don Quixote Family Residence Hall. The flying squirrel put down the encrypted Den Mushi, looked up at the blonde boy in front of him wearing a pink feather coat, and said calmly. You heard it too, I need your help this time. Doflamingo's sunglasses flashed with a strange cold light, and he laughed nervously. I should be able to hand over about 200 people. It just so happened that a group of ignorant guys made trouble in my casino and were caught by Diamante on the spot. I was originally worried about how to deal with them. The flying squirrel did not comment and said coldly, "This is not what I care about. 200 people are enough." He didn't care about the Don Quixote family's activities in the North Sea, and even felt a little disgusted. But since Darren acquiesced to this, and Doflamingo was quite sensible and didn't interfere in some illegal businesses that Darren didn't allow in the North Sea, Flying Squirrel turned a blind eye to it. Casinos, loan sharks, private banks, brothels, theft, arms smuggling. These ancient businesses can't be completely banned, and they are not within the jurisdiction of their navy. In this case, it's better to let Doflamingo control these businesses. On the one hand, it can collect a lot of taxes to obtain huge funds to expand the North Sea fleet. On the other hand, it is convenient for management. Once something happens, just go to the Don Quixote family to settle the accounts. As for businesses like human trafficking, organ trading and drugs, Darren explicitly prohibits them. This is the rule and bottom line he set for the North Sea, and no one is allowed to cross it. The remaining 300 people will be dealt with by the North Sea fleet. After the rat finished speaking, he picked up the wine on the marble coffee table in front of him, raised his head and drank it all, his eyes full of murderous intent. It can be imagined that with such a simple sentence, the entire North Sea will usher in a terrible bloody storm. Thank you for your hospitality, this wine is very good. In addition, Darren asked me to tell you that he is very satisfied with your performance during this period. Ying, that's even better. Doflamingo laughed strangely. But Admiral Flying Squirrel, I have a question for you. Looking at the back of the flying squirrel who turned and left, Doflamingo's mouth corners raised a defiant arc. The flying squirrel paused. Doflamingo sat there, and an inexplicable deep breath gradually emanated from his body. The 10 fingers of both hands were slightly bent and kept moving, as if they were hooking something in the void. Nothing, I'm just curious, do you, the then North Sea Admiral, have enough qualifications to take over the position of Godfather? Before he finished speaking, he laughed arrogantly and waved his hand heavily. Swish. It seemed as if a sharp blade passed through the void. Swish. The walls and floors of the resident hall were silently torn open with several deep scratches. Doflamingo's pupils suddenly shrank into fine needles, and his smile froze on his face, as if he had seen something incredible. The then North Sea Admiral Flying Squirrel stood there motionless, still with his back to him. His body was cut into 2 halves by invisible silk threads. But there was no blood flowing out of the incision, and the wound that should have been filled with flesh and blood was instead beating with hot plasma. What do you think? The flying squirrel's broken head slowly turned around and sneered at Doflamingo. In an instant, a bone-chilling chill surged from the soles of Doflamingo's feet, giving him goosebumps all over his body. Then the flying squirrel disappeared. At least in Doflamingo's vision, the figure of Admiral Bahai disappeared like a ghost. As if he had noticed something, Doflamingo's face changed drastically, and he stood up and turned around. But it was too late. A hand wearing a black leather glove had already grabbed his neck. Doflamingo, you are Darren's godson, I won't bother with you this time. Holding Doflamingo's neck with his left hand, the flying squirrel said expressionlessly as he looked at him with a gradually red face. But if there is a next time, and you still want to die. The naturally hanging right hand burst into violent blue lightning, illuminating the dark hall of the station like daylight. I don't mind trying it out. What is it like to kill a celestial dragon? Is it really like Darren said, can it make me awaken the Conqueror's haki? Doflamingo's eyes twitched violently. The flying squirrel smiled and let go. He considerately straightened Doflamingo's messy collar, then stepped back, stretched out his hand, and smiled. Then, I'll trouble you to cooperate with the next work. Doflamingo had not yet reacted to the ability displayed by the flying squirrel. His expression still retained surprise and shock. He subconsciously reached out and shook the latter's hand. After the flying squirrel left the lobby for a full minute, he sat down on the sofa with a bang. Without saying a word, he picked up the red wine bottle and drank it hard. Gulp gurgle. The blood-like luster of wine overflowed from the corner of his mouth, wetting and staining his white shirt red, but he didn't notice it. Until the bottle of red wine was finished, he smashed the bottle heavily to the ground. The bottle broke into pieces, fragments splashed everywhere, and the remaining wine splashed on the gray wall. Doflamingo gasped for air and it took a while for him to catch his breath. He leaned back, resting his head on the sofa, looking up at the huge dome with intricate decorations in the resident hall, his expression uncertain. At a certain moment, G.A. Doflamingo's crazy, paranoid and twisted laughter, like the devil's muttering, rippled in the dim and empty resident hall. Interesting. Really interesting. It turned out to be the legendary invincible devil fruit. You found it all. You are really amazing. My respected godfather. Are you so afraid of me? You even gave such a precious thunder fruit to the waste of flying squirrel. Ying. This game is becoming more and more interesting. He laughed wildly, and the veins on his forehead bulged and squirmed like earthworms. Well, let's see. In the end, will you kill me first, or will I find a chance to kill you? Ying. I appreciate everything. Happy Mid-Autumn Festival. Chapter 170 Happy Holidays. Happy Holidays. Happy Holidays. A neutral island in the New World. The streets were bustling at night, with lights and decorations everywhere. People wore all kinds of festive costumes and congratulated each other at the market. In the bathroom of an ordinary hotel, Draeger turned on the shower, raised his head, and let the boiling hot water wash away the fatigue accumulated over the past few days. Stripes of blood slid down the water flow. After a while, Draeger reached out to turn off the valve of the hot water, walked out of the shower room, and came to the mirror. He raised his hand to wipe the mirror covered with steam, and saw his scarred body and the slightly unfamiliar face. The scars on his face had begun to scab, and the net-like lines were deeply imprinted on his left face like a tattoo, diluting the original gentle temperament and adding a bit of wildness, coldness and domineering. Looking at the thin face in the mirror that seemed a little unfamiliar, Draeger exhaled a long breath and smiled at himself in the mirror a little far-fetchedly. He found that he had indeed matured a lot. From now on, you will have to walk alone, young man. He murmured softly. After saying that, Dorag put on a large bathrobe and walked out of the bathroom. In the hotel's private room, a man in a cheap black suit stood there like a shadow, waiting quietly. Seeing Dorag walk out of the bathroom, the man bowed slightly. Guest, you are safe now. This island is located in the New World. I have prepared the specific sea chart and the permanent pointers of the nearby islands for you and put them on the desk. Drag looked at the ordinary-looking man in front of him, who was so ordinary that he could not be found in the crowd, and suddenly said, "Do you know my true identity?" The man replied respectfully, "It doesn't matter. It is my mission to bring you to the New World, and now my mission has been completed. But if you insist on knowing the answer to this question, I can answer it truthfully." He said in a deep voice. "I know you are Monkey D. Dragon, the blood of the Navy, hero, Monkey D. Garp, a monster, in the Navy, and now a world-class criminal with a high reward of 2 billion Baileys by the world government and the Navy." Drag was silent for a moment, and then asked, "Do you know what I did?" The man replied, "I know that you killed a celestial dragon." Dorag frowned. "Then you should know that your so-called mission may cost you your life. Besides, aren't you afraid that I will kill you to silence you?" The man shook his head and said, "It is my greatest honor to work for that lord. As long as I can complete the order he gave me, I will sacrifice my life." Dorag looked at him deeply. "Darren's men." The man did not deny it, but bowed deeply and said, 3 years ago, Lord Darren saved the lives of my family and gave them more wealth than they could spend in their lifetime. This is what I should do. In addition, Mr. Dorag, Lord Darren asked me to tell you something." Dorag was stunned and asked subconsciously, "What?" The man raised his head and smiled. He said, "In fact, I can understand your feelings better than anyone else. After all, there are more than one celestial dragons who died in the North Sea. There are more than one celestial dragons who died in the North Sea. Dorag was stunned when he heard this, as if struck by lightning. He seemed to realize something, and his eyes suddenly widened. Could it be? His face suddenly became extremely complicated, with various emotions such as astonishment, shock, confusion, realization, embarrassment, intertwined on his face at the same time, which looked extremely wonderful. That's it. Dorag understood everything at once. Why can't the truth behind the attack of Shield Saint be found out? Why did Darren tell him that he understood how he felt when he killed the celestial dragon? Why did he say, "You shouldn't be so impulsive"? Why did he look at him with a helpless, disappointed look in his eyes? If that's the case, everything makes sense. Thinking of the pleasure and prestige of killing the celestial dragon in front of Darren, Dragon felt his toes involuntarily bend and tighten. Wait. He suddenly remembered another thing. If Darren had killed Shield Saint, with the wisdom of General Warring States, he would never have noticed it. After all, General Warring States was in charge of the case at the beginning. But if General Warring States noticed something, why would Darren be fine? And instead rise to prominence? There is only one possibility. That is, Darren did not leave any traces. He did it too cleanly. Drag's thoughts quickly became clear. I see. A helpless smile gradually appeared on Dorag's face. I guess in the eyes of the Warring States General, compared to Darren's shrewdness, I am just a fool. He muttered to himself. Now Dorag finally understood. The Warring States General sent Darren to hunt him at the first time. Regret? No, Dorag did not regret it. Even if time could go back, he would kill the celestial dragon without hesitation. This is his character. He is far from being as calculating as Darren. However, with the words of the man in front of him, Dorag suddenly felt that the depression and loneliness in his heart were swept away in an instant. It turns out, there is another person in this world who dares to draw his sword against the honorable and great God, like me. This feeling is like a person groping with a lonely lamp in the long dark night, after experiencing countless hardships and enduring endless loneliness. Suddenly, he found that there was another person who was also walking with a candle in the dark night. A feeling of incomparable warmth and even heat arose in his heart. Darren. Dorag whispered softly, his eyes were a little red, and his fists were clenched tightly. I thought we would drift apart from now on, and even go our separate ways. I didn't expect that we could still walk side by side. No. He shook his head, thinking of the legendary North Sea Fleet and Darren's confidence in controlling everything, and said in a voice that only he could hear. Maybe you have gone further than me. Then, Mr. Dorag, I'll leave first. At this time, the man said softly. He pointed to the cake on the table and smiled. This is my gift to you. Although I don't understand that song, I feel a great power from it. I believe your future path must be difficult and sacred. I hope this insignificant thought can add a little sporadic sweetness to your great and painful career. He bowed deeply, his expression sincere and true. Happy holidays. Bang. In the night sky outside the hotel, colorful fireworks suddenly spread out, gorgeous and beautiful. Dragon's eyes were dazed for a moment, and then he remembered that the new year had arrived. He smiled softly and said, You too, happy holidays. Go home quickly and reunite with your family. This is the most important thing, isn't it? I'm grateful for everything. Happy holidays. Chapter 171 Don't think I don't know what you did. Marine Headquarters, Marineford. Marshal's office, Marshal's office. Sakaski, Darren and Borsellino, who had just returned to the headquarters from the North Sea, stood there. The former two were still filled with the smell of blood and were covered in dust, while the latter was carelessly putting his hands in his pockets. Giant Kong, who had a mohawk hairstyle, crossed his arms, revealing his bronze skin and strong arms. He looked at the three people in front of him with undisguised admiration. Thank you for your hard work in this operation. As he spoke, he slowly closed the detailed battle report in his hand. Sakaski said gloomily, Marshal Kong, This time I made a mistake in judgment and lacked ability, and I failed to keep the traitor dragon. I am willing to accept any form and condition of punishment." Steel Bone Kong smiled and comforted. "The failure of this mission is not your responsibility, Sakazuki, you don't have to blame yourself. We have all seen the strength and talent of Dragon, and his ability can be exerted beyond the level on the sea, occupying a great advantage. Besides, no one would have thought that he would awaken the Conqueror's haki. You have done a good job." Hearing this, Sakazuki clenched his fists and gritted his teeth. "Marshal Kong, I hope to continue the mission of hunting down Dragon. As long as you give me enough time, I will definitely be able to catch that traitor." 4x. Before he finished speaking, Kong Gang waved his hand to interrupt him and shook his head. "Let's stop here for now, Sakazuki. The most important thing for you now is to heal your injuries and not leave any sequelae. As for the work of hunting down Drago, I will select another suitable candidate to carry out it." After saying that, Kong Gang turned his head to look at Borsellino and said with a smile. "Borsellino, how is the research work of laser cannon weapons in the newly established Navy Science Department going?" Borsellino sighed and said with some regret. "I'm really sorry, Marshal Kong. The research and development of laser cannon weapons is still in the final critical period, and the problem of replenishing the energy system is still being solved." Hearing this, Darren's eyes suddenly flickered slightly. After hearing Borsellino's report, Cyborg nodded without doubt and said thoughtfully. "Well, Dr. Vegapunk is a great genius who has been ahead of the world for 500 years. With his wisdom and vision, it should not be difficult for him to solve this problem. We must speed up the development of laser weapons. If we can use this weapon on our warships on a large scale, it will be an immeasurable improvement to our Navy's combat power." Borsellino nodded in agreement and said slowly. "I will do it as soon as possible." "Well, then you two should leave first. I have something to talk to Darren about." Sakazuki was slightly stunned, looked at Darren, quickly retracted his gaze, raised his hand to salute Gangukong, and then turned and left. Borsellino smiled meaningfully and followed closely. The office door closed again. Darren was the only one standing in front of the desk, facing the huge, Jung X plaque on the gray and white wall in front of him. "Darren, you did a great job this time, and I am very satisfied." Gangukong raised his head calmly, looked at the Commodore in front of him, and a smile appeared on his face. Darren nodded slightly, and said modestly, "This is all thanks to the support of General Zhongguo. I just did my best, everything for justice." Gangukong smiled and shook his head. "Zhongguo is right, you are really smart." He raised the battle report in his hand. In the fierce battle with the vicious criminal Drago, Commodore Rogers Darren successfully prevented the target from escaping with his heroic and fearless attitude and outstanding strength. More than 1,000 witnesses saw Commodore Rogers Darren seriously injured, but he resolutely maintained the battle area in an unmanned area. The fierce battle between the two destroyed at least 80 buildings. Steel Bone Kong's smile suddenly became sarcastic. "I didn't expect that you are not only smart, but also a first-class acting skill." The coldness in Steel Bone Kong's voice seemed to carry a strong sense of oppression, which made people shudder. It can be imagined that if it were an ordinary person, he would probably be in a state of panic in an instant. But Darren's expression did not show the slightest panic, but he asked with a blank look. "Acting skills. Marshal Kong, I don't understand what you mean." Giant Kong sneered even more, with his broad palms supporting the table, his body leaning forward slightly, full of aggression. "Really? Don't think I don't know what you did, Darren boy. You deliberately let Drago run away, didn't you? Rumor has it that you have a good relationship with him." Darren's face became more puzzled, and he shook his head. "Drago and I are just pure colleagues, and there is not much contact between us. I am a freshman in the officer training camp, but he has already graduated. As for personal style, the two of us are even more different, and we can't talk about it at all. As everyone knows, he is an idol worshipped by countless young Navy men, with the blood of a hero flowing in his body, and has an unprecedentedly strong sense of justice. But I have a bad record and a bad reputation, but I just got lucky and killed a legendary pirate. Other than that, there is nothing worth praising." I am greedy for power and eager for promotion. Dragon killed a distinguished world noble and is the common enemy of our navy and even the whole world. As long as I arrest him, my rank can at least be promoted by 1 level. How could I deliberately let him go? Steelbone Kong narrowed his eyes and stared at Darren with a scrutinizing look, as if trying to find the slightest flaw in the latter's expression. But he failed. Darren's demeanor, expression, speech and reasons were impeccable, and there was nothing wrong with them in any aspect. So Steelbone Kong smiled with satisfaction. Very good, if there are CP agents from the world government coming to investigate and question them later, you answer him like this. Darren's mouth twitched. It almost scared me. He kept an elegant smile and nodded. Marshal Kong, please rest assured, I will report truthfully. But, will the government really send someone to investigate? He asked with some curiosity. Gong Ji Kong's eyebrows gradually tightened, and he sighed. You are gradually entering the core decision-making level of the headquarters. Even if I don't say something, you can see it. Please thank you for everything. Chapter 172 I came at the wrong time. I am stupid and I just came to the headquarters. I don't know many things yet. Darren smiled and answered without any leaks. Gong Ji Kong. You dare to kill the celestial dragons, and you still say you don't understand. Warring states wanted to test you before, but you were forced to bypass you. You still say you are not familiar with the situation of the Navy headquarters. He took out a cigar from the cigar box in a bad mood and threw it to Darren. You are really a natural politician. I won't beat around the bush with you. Gongu Kong bit a cigar and lit it, and said slowly. After these 2 killings of celestial dragons, the government's high-level doubts and distrust of our navy have become deeper and deeper. Darren was about to light the cigar, but when he heard what Gangu Kong said, he added. No, it was just once. The specific cause of the attack on the celestial dragons in the North Sea has been found out. The official ship where Lord Surd Saint was attacked by a large sea king creature and unfortunately died. I personally express my deep apologies and condolences for this. Okay, you said a sea king attack is a sea king attack. Gongu Kong waved his hand speechlessly, took a puff of the cigar, and then continued after several seconds. In short, the government's distrust has reached its highest point since I took office as the Navy Admiral. As for whether the government will send someone to investigate this incident, I won't hide it. I don't know about you either. But what is certain is that the promotion plan that was basically finalized has been temporarily suspended. Promotion plan. Darren was a little curious. Yes. Cyborg Sora nodded. According to the original plan, I should go to the Holy Land of Marihoa to serve as the Commander-in-Chief of the world government in the next 3 months, and Sengoku will naturally take over my position as the Marshal of the Navy headquarters. But now because of what happened with Dragon, the promotion plan that was confirmed has been suspended. It's like this. Darren suddenly felt a sense of enlightenment. In fact, before this, he had more or less heard a little bit of the rumor. Sengoku was about to be promoted from the position of Admiral of the headquarters to the Admiral of the Navy. At that time, he was somewhat confused. After all, Darren vaguely remembered that the timeline of Sengoku's promotion to the Admiral of the Navy was not that early. You know, in the Ohara incident after the opening of the Great Pirate Era, the person who issued the Demon Slayer order was Sengoku, and he was still the Admiral of the headquarters at that time. Now that I think about it, everything is right. It is very likely that Sengoku was questioned by the government about his leadership because of Dragon's defection, incident ability, resulting in him being able to maintain the rank of Admiral for a long time, and being unable to be promoted to Marshal. But this is normal. Drag is not an ordinary Rear Admiral. The blood, identity and symbolic significance he represents have, to some extent, exceeded the scope of the Admiral of the Navy. And such a hero's son, who was highly expected by the entire Navy, openly killed a world noble celestial dragon. This is definitely an extremely heavy blow to the Navy as a whole. This is only temporary. It is estimated that it will not take long. When all doubts disappear with time, the world government will forget about this matter. Darren said with a smile on his face. After all, the government also needs our navy as their main combat force. Before that, I would like to congratulate Marshal Kong on his promotion in advance. Steel Bone Kong looked at Darren and suddenly laughed. Don't be so optimistic. This time, it's not just me and Sengoku who are implicated. Darren's smile froze. I only heard Kong gang smilingly. Although your battle report is beautifully written and there is nothing wrong with it, the killing of the celestial dragons this time took place in the North Sea anyway. The 2 consecutive killings of celestial dragons occurred in the North Sea. Under the jurisdiction of you, the King of the North Sea. So I regret to tell you that your originally confirmed promotion plan has also been terminated. Here, he emphasized with some evil humor. Of course, this is only temporary. It will not take long before all doubts disappear with time and the world government will forget about it. Darren. Okay, the old ones are the best. It seems that the 300 million Baileys are too little. I should have asked for more. That's the rank of Rear Admiral of the Navy headquarters. How many Marines can't cross the threshold in their lifetime? It's the career ceiling of many Marines' military career. It was delayed just like that. Originally, Darren was thinking that after being promoted to Rear Admiral, he could be a little proud in front of Sakazuki and Borsellino, and sit on an equal footing. No longer need to salute the superiors in a fake manner. Now, the duck in the mouth has flown away. Damn Dorag, if I had known, I would have kicked harder. Do you have to do it in the North Sea? It's not enough to wipe your ass, now you have to take the blame. Thinking of this, Darren said helplessly. I am willing to accept any arrangement of the headquarters. But despite that, he didn't feel too much. The position of Major General of the headquarters was not a big deal to him. Okay, I'll give you a reminder. Steelbone Kong nodded, glanced at the night outside the window, and said with a smile. Let's talk about this, go back quickly, the woman from Wano country is probably waiting anxiously. When he said the last sentence, the old man deliberately winked at Darren, with a teasing tone. Okay, Marshal Kong. Darren raised his hand and saluted. Well, go ahead, happy holidays, Darren boy. Gang Gukong waved his hand. Navy headquarters, office's family compound. Darren looked at the lanterns hanging on the porch in front of the compound and the warm lights emanating from the compound wall, and a warm feeling welled up in his heart. He thought for a moment, took out a handkerchief to wipe his stained face, and took off the bandages on his body. He patted his face, trying to make himself look less tired, with a smile on his face. Although he considered himself a scum, he didn't want the gentle Ashi to worry about him. He pushed open the door to the compound. Ashi, I'm back, happy holidays. Darren froze in place, his raised military boots frozen in midair. In the living room inside the house. 2 beautiful figures with very different temperaments sat opposite each other, there was a table full of delicious food, and the atmosphere was a little off. My husband, you're back. Tien Yushi heard the voice, turned around, and smiled. The corner of Darren's mouth twitched. I came at the wrong time. Wait, I suddenly remembered that General Sengoku wanted to see me for something. No, General Sengoku didn't look for you. The opposite of Tien Yushi, Gion, who had a high ponytail and a dashing temperament, looked at Darren and smiled dangerously. You came at the right time. Darren. This line always feels wrong. Please be grateful for everything. Chapter 173 Tien Yushi and Gion. The night is seductive, and the starry sky is shining like the Milky Way, as bright as a picture. In the direction of the civilian area, a bunch of colorful fireworks rose into the night sky, and then scattered like fireflies, dotted with starry light traces on the night sky with a full moon hanging. The children's lively laughter came from outside the wall, mixed with the sound of running from time to time. The exquisite food in front of them was still steaming. Miso soup with kelp floating in it, grilled eel with oily gloss, thinly sliced wagyu grilled meat, cold tofu like jelly, 3 bowls of white rice. The fragrant smell of the food was so appetizing and warm. Add to that the 2 beauties with different temperaments and styles in front of them, which was simply a feast for the eyes. Such a beautiful scenery, such a good time. Darren felt like he was sitting on pins and needles, as if there was a thorn in his buttocks, and he was uncomfortable all over. He looked to the left carefully, and Tianyu-shi, wearing a loose kimono dress, was kneeling there in a standard posture. As always, she maintained his elegance no matter what, and his every frown and smile was very graceful, showing the unique etiquette and upbringing of Wano country. The long light green hair was tied into a bun with a wooden chopstick, and there was a unique charm of a new wife between her eyebrows. The slightly plump buttocks gently pressed the feet in white stockings, making people unable to move their eyes away. Darren just took a look, and before he had time to appreciate it carefully, he felt a dangerous gaze from the right. He quickly retracted his gaze and turned to look at Gion on the right. Today, Gion was still wearing that hot tight skirt, with slender eyebrows and a high nose bridge. Coupled with the high ponytail tied behind her head, she exuded a feeling of a perfect combination of a girl and a queen, with a kind of charm and sexiness that did not match her age. From Darren's angle, Gion stared at him with unkind eyes, with her hands wrapped under her chest, and the exaggerated arc almost completely covered her white arms. It was really painful. Darren's mouth twitched. Why did Gion come here today? Darren saw that the atmosphere was very tense, so he thought of finding a topic. But he knew it was going to be bad as soon as he said it. Sure enough, hearing what Darren said, Gion raised her eyebrows and sneered. What's wrong, don't you welcome me? Or did my arrival disturb your warm life? Darren smiled awkwardly. Ahem, that's not the case. I'm not thinking about the big festival. Chief of Staff Crane is probably waiting for you to go back for dinner. Although it was easy to flirt with girls in the North Sea in the past, Gion was not the open-minded ladies he had hooked up with in the North Sea. This girl was the apple of the eye of several big men in the Navy headquarters, a Navy flower, who dared to call Garp, Little Garp. If it was before, it would be fine, but now he was so unlucky that he ruined Gion. Although there is a passive element, who can Darren go to for justice? Can he say, I was forced, to Sengoku, Crane, Garp, Zephyr and others? If he said this, his fate would probably be even worse than Dragon. Besides, no matter how you look at it, he has taken advantage of this matter. Well, it's still 4 times the advantage. Sister Crane and General Sengoku have gone to Vice Admiral Garp. Gion sneered. Darren's eyes twitched. At this time, Tianyu-shi smiled gently, raised her soft little hand and gently held Gion, and said to help. I invited Sister Gion here. I thought that Sister Gion was your subordinate in Beihai before, and she should have helped you a lot. Now you are the same students in the officer training camp, so of course you need to get closer. She looked at Darren with a smile. Plus it's a festive season, so I took the initiative to invite Sister Gion to have a simple meal with us. Husband, you don't mind, do you? Of course I don't mind, this is a good thing. Darren was slightly stunned and said. He noticed that when she held Gion's hand, the latter subconsciously shrank, but in the end he didn't refuse, and the coldness between his eyebrows also dissipated a lot. Did she deal with Gion now? When did it happen? Darren was a little confused. But the next second he met Ashi's watery eyes and understood it instantly. Ashi is going to assist. Then, Sister Gion, let's start eating. Tianyu-shi retracted his gaze, smiled at Gion, and said softly. I hope you don't dislike my cooking skills. Gion shook his head gently. How could that be? So under Ashi's enthusiastic greeting, the 3 of them started to eat in the soft candlelight. Come, husband, try this miso soup. Tianyu-shi scooped a bowl of soup for Darren and looked at him expectantly. Darren took a sip and his eyes lit up. It tastes delicious. He couldn't help but praise it. He didn't like the taste of the monk soup, it always felt a bit salty. But the monk soup cooked by Ashi was just right in saltiness, and maybe it was because of the fish bones, it had a unique sweetness that made people's taste buds open. Gion's sister, try it too, see if you can get used to it. When Tianyu-shi heard Darren's praise, she couldn't help but smile, and her eyes were full of happiness. She also scooped a bowl of monk soup for Ziyuan and handed it over with both hands. Facing the gentle and lovely Tianyu-shi, Ziyuan couldn't think of refusing. In fact, she was very conflicted at first and didn't want to come. The most important thing is that when she saw Tian Yushi, who was dressed as a young woman with a bun, appear at her door, she couldn't help but feel an indescribable guilt in her heart. It felt like she had done something wrong and destroyed the happy family that others should have. But for some reason, when she saw Tian Yushi's kind and gentle face and warm conversation, she couldn't bear to refuse the latter's invitation. And deep in her heart, there was also an impulse to be competitive. She wanted to see with her own eyes, what kind of woman this woman was, what kind of person. But when she came to this house, Gion soon regretted it. Tenjutsu Toki had tidied up this house so well that there was nothing wrong with it. She was like a perfect wife, tidying up the house, preparing meals, and quietly waiting for her lover to return home safely. It was at that moment that Gion suddenly realized that she could not be compared with the gentle woman in front of her. Feeling ashamed. With a complicated mind, Gion picked up the spoon and tasted the soup lightly. As soon as the warm monk soup entered her mouth, she couldn't help but squint her eyes comfortably. It tastes so good. Please everything, thank you very much. Chapter 174 Great Cause. Gion swears that this is the best miso soup she has ever tasted in her life. It tastes salty but not greasy, with the unique freshness of seafood. After drinking it, it seems that the whole body becomes warm. This taste. It feels like returning home. How does it taste, Sister Gion? Is it delicious? Tianyushi's eyes sparkled, and she looked at Gion with expectation. Looking at Tianyushi's smiling eyebrows, the long eyelashes on her eyes trembled slightly, which made her look cute and moving. Gion pursed her lips, and was actually a little afraid to look into the former's eyes. She nodded and whispered, "Well, Sister Shi's cooking skills are very good, and the miso soup is delicious." "Great." Tianyushi was overjoyed and took Gion's hand, with a beautiful blush on her face, and said with a smile, "Since you like it, come to my house often for dinner in the future, and I will make more delicious things for you." Home. The speaker may not mean it, but the listener may take it seriously. Gion's mood became extremely complicated after hearing this. She, who has always been strong and cold, faced Tian Yushi's expectant eyes, but she couldn't bear to say anything to refuse, and just nodded silently. Darren looked at Gion quietly and couldn't help laughing in his heart. Ashi's charm lies not in her stunning beauty, but in her gentle and virtuous temperament that makes anyone feel pity and protection. It is precisely because of this that she was able to gain the support and love of so many people in Wano country in the original plot. "Come, try this grilled eel I made again." The meal was unexpectedly harmonious. There was no quarrel, no verbal battle. Under Ashi's tenderness and enthusiasm, Gion did not get angry, and Darren did not commit suicide. They were just like a family, enjoying themselves. After the meal, Darren took out a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, walked out of the house and came to the yard. Under the shade of the tree, 2 lounge chairs stood there quietly. Darren's eyes were dazed for a moment. Just a few months ago, a young man with positive expectations and hopes lay on one of these chairs, drunk, and screaming his blood and youth. Now, the boy's passion and second-year student status have disappeared, becoming mature and tough. The boy with the blood of a hero has become a world-class vicious criminal in the blink of an eye. Things have changed. Even though Darren has always been determined, he couldn't help but feel a lot of emotion at this moment. He pursed his lips, walked under the tree, and sat down on one of the lounge chairs. Quietly looking at the starry night sky in the distance, he silently lit a cigarette and digested his inner emotions. "So, Senior Dragon, did you really kill the celestial dragon?" A voice suddenly sounded beside him. Darren glanced at Gion, who came to his side, smiled, and said in a low voice, "Yes, I was the first person to arrest him. It's a pity, let him run away. Otherwise, I could at least be promoted to the next level." Gion bit his lower lip and suddenly cursed in a low voice. "Liar." "Ah." Darren was stunned. Gion turned around and stared at Darren. "I said you were a liar. You are obviously very sad, aren't you?" Darren was silent for a moment, then smiled disapprovingly. How could that be? I am not familiar with Dorag. He is the son of a hero, and I am the biggest scum. I just regret not catching him myself. Guillaume suddenly sneered. So how long do you want to pretend to be a scum? If I remember correctly, you are still injured now, aren't you? But you pretended to be fine and walked into the house with a smile on your face. You are obviously a very gentle person. Hey, this is not a good compliment to a man. Especially in a Japanese anime, the adjective, yasushi, translated as gentle, is a term exclusive to some useless male protagonists. So Darren said unhappily. I'm not pretending, I'm really a loser. As for Dorag, I'm not sad, but I'm more emotional and envious. He slowly exhaled a stream of smoke from his mouth. It's his greatest luck for a man to find a great career that he can do for his whole life in his prime. What about you? Guillaume stared at Darren with his eyes, as if expecting some kind of answer. What is the great career you want to do for your whole life? Me. Darren seemed to sigh with some emotion, thought seriously for a while, and then said with a serious face. Now that you mention it, I also know that there are some problems with my life. Guillaume was slightly stunned when he heard this. Could it be that this guy is really reflecting on his life? In the past month, Guillaume has been unable to accept the fact that he has fallen in love with a scum. But if Darren can change and turn back, she couldn't help but feel a sense of expectation in her heart. I have thought a lot, especially after the incident with Dorag. I began to re-examine my life. Darren frowned slightly and said with emotion. What should a person live for in his life? If I am so young and I am greedy for enjoyment, enjoy food, enjoy love, enjoy strong liquor, enjoy power, enjoy money, enjoy life. Make money that others can't make in their lifetime, and live a luxurious life that others can't imagine in their lifetime, then when I get old, I will find. Guillaume's eyes lit up, and he said anxiously, discover what? I found that there is no regret in my life. Darren exhaled a breath of smoke leisurely, his eyes half closed, full of emotion, as if he had discovered the true meaning of life. Guillaume. You bastard, scum. The curve of her chest rose and fell violently because of anger. Guillaume gnashed her teeth and trembled with anger. I was just looking forward to it. This guy hasn't changed at all. He is still the bastard who makes people hate him. She glared at Darren fiercely, pushed the door and left without looking back. Darren felt helpless immediately. I was obviously telling the truth. While I am powerful, I don't want to spend lavishly and enjoy life as much as possible. Could it be that after the world government finds out that I killed a celestial dragon and I am wanted all over the world, I can enjoy it? It's too late. Draeger is a living example here. It's just a lesson. He sighed. Husband, you shouldn't make Sister Guillaume angry like this. Tenzuki walked to Darren with a helpless expression, pulled his hand, and persuaded him. Hurry up and catch up with her to comfort her. In fact, Guillaume's sister-in-law cares about you very much. Suru no Nakagami visited me a few days ago and told me something. Do you still remember that you were imprisoned by Kaido in the New World? In fact, at that time, although she didn't want to admit it, Sister Guillaume repeatedly begged the Crane staff to persuade the Warring States General to send troops to rescue you. When Ashi finished speaking, Darren was slightly startled. I'm grateful for everything. Chapter 175 Who am I to you? How could such a thing happen? That arrogant girl Guillaume actually begged the Crane staff to persuade the Warring States General to send troops for me. Darren really couldn't imagine what kind of picture it was that the always cold Guillaume blushed and stammered in front of the Crane staff. My husband, you are not careful enough. Well, how should I put it? I should say that your mind is not on the girl's heart. Tien Yushi pushed Darren's arm with some complaints. Sister Guillaume is a very good girl. She just has a hard mouth, but in fact she is very kind-hearted. Although she doesn't say it, she still likes you very much. Go now. This is a life-threatening question, I feel. Darren's eyes twitched slightly, and he glanced at Tianyu cautiously, and asked tentatively. You won't be angry. Tien Yushi smiled brightly, and a proud look bloomed on her innocent face. No way. I am my husband's first wife. Women's inexplicable comparison is really strange and scary. Darren secretly complained in his heart. At this time, Tien Yushi thought about it and added. Moreover, Sister Gion has a special status in the headquarters. If she can also become your husband's lover, wouldn't it also be able to add a lot of help to your husband's career? Look at this. I really want to cry. Darren was almost moved to tears, and couldn't help but open his arms and hug Tien Yushi tightly. Ah she, you are so nice. Quote. Where can I find such a virtuous, sensible and generous wife? Darren suddenly discovered that the feudal dregs of Wano country, no, the customs and traditions are still quite good. Hurry up. Tien Yushi's face was flushed by Darren's enthusiasm. She twisted her body shyly, lowered her head with eyes full of love, and her voice was as soft as a mosquito. The dark night sky was constantly dotted with colorful fireworks, like falling stars. The dancing light made the back of a man walking alone on the street in Gion look a little lonely and pitiful. Damn bastard. I still had a little expectation for him. Gion hugged her slightly thin shoulders with both hands, her face puffed up slightly because of anger, and she cursed in a low voice in indignation. She kept kicking the small stones on the ground forward. Thinking of that warm and peaceful home. And that perfect and impeccable gentle woman who even she couldn't get angry with. Gion felt a sense of emptiness in her heart for some reason. The night wind blew, and the cold wind at the end of the year made her hug her shoulders subconsciously. In the distance of the street were noisy children, people's laughter, and the bright lights of thousands of houses. But none of these belonged to her. Asshole. A feeling of emptiness she had never felt before surged into her heart. Gion cursed in a low voice with hatred, kicked a small stone away with force, and her eyes gradually turned red. If you keep kicking, all the stones on the street will be kicked away by you. At this time, a carefree voice suddenly sounded behind him. Gion's heart trembled, and he wiped his eyes quickly. He turned his head and saw the Commodore with a teasing smile on his lips, and said viciously. Why are you here? Shouldn't you be at home with your wife? Looking at Gion's slightly red eyes and the sour tone, Darren was a little amused. He had a teasing heart in his heart, and blinked with evil taste. Anyway, there is still a lot of time to accompany Ashi tonight, so there is no rush. Besides, as the host, don't you have to see the guests off? There is still a lot of time to accompany her tonight. Hearing Darren's words, Gion's heart became more and more sour, he bit his silver teeth, his eyes became more and more red, and he said fiercely. You don't need to send me off. I will go back by myself. You should go back and accompany your perfect and gentle wife. Anyway, I am just a guest to you, right? No, 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 you are not just my guest. Darren shook his head. Then who am I to you? Gion looked up suddenly, a barely visible light flashed in his eyes, and his voice came through the night, with a faint sense of urgency and expectation. Well. Darren scratched his head pretending to be helpless. A subordinate who often argues with me. A colleague who calls me a scumbag and a scum every day. A comrade in arms with a somewhat cute personality, a cute girl inside and a queen outside. He counted them carefully on his fingers. Well, that's about it. Gion's face became darker and darker as he listened, and finally it was like a frost, and he was so angry. You bastard, She felt her mouth blocked before she could finish her words. She subconsciously wanted to struggle, but a rough and powerful hand tightly hugged her slender waist and held her tightly in his arms. The heavy breath with the smell of tobacco rushed to her face, and Gion's pupils quickly dilated, but her stiff body gradually softened. The longing for not seeing each other for a long time, the complex emotions of love and hate, at this moment turned into blood and rushed straight to her brain, making her mind blank, and she was no longer able to resist. She closed her eyes unconsciously. Then gradually hugged Darren's neck and responded subconsciously. After 10 seconds. The lips parted. The crystal-like silk was hooked on the slowly parted lips. Gion panted with a red face, standing there in a daze. I actually kissed him on the street outside. She seemed to suddenly remember something, and looked around with a guilty conscience. She was relieved to make sure that there was no one on the street. Then she wanted to be angry. "What are you doing, you bastard? Who do you think I am?" Guillaume bit his lower lip and stared at Darren. Darren recalled the kiss just now. Looking at the slightly red face in front of him, the military-clad sister was filled with a strong sense of accomplishment. "Didn't I answer this question just now?" Without giving Guillaume a chance to get angry, Darren smiled softly. "It's the person I like." Guillaume's resentment and anger disappeared instantly. She stared at the man in front of her with her eyes wide open, and said in disbelief, "What did you say?" Darren smiled and said, "Let's go, I'll take you somewhere." He didn't give Guillaume a chance to refuse, and directly hugged her slender waist and raised his hand. With a swish, a dark and solemn long sword suddenly flew from a distance and stopped steadily in front of Darren. This sword. Guillaume didn't bother to struggle, and immediately realized the extraordinariness of the sword when he saw Yan Mo, and widened his eyes with curiosity. A famous sword from Wano country, one of the rare demon swords in the world, a sharp blade that is said to be able to destroy hell. Yan Mo. Darren explained casually, and then added, "Don't think about it, I tamed it with great difficulty. I'm back. JPG. Please thank you for everything."